Polar Bear de Vaz, 28-year-old soldier. During Arctic drill, April 12, 2025. The wind howled across the frozen expanse of Alaska's interior with a ferocity that seemed to penetrate every layer of clothing, every barrier that human engineering could devise against the Arctic's merciless assault. Temperatures had plummeted to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill pushed the effective temperature down to a bone-shattering minus 65. This was the kind of cold that could freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes, the kind of environment where a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. Private First Class Anthony James Miller, 28 years old and originally from Bakersfield, California, had never experienced anything like this in his life. Born and raised in the Central Valley where summer temperatures routinely exceeded 100 degrees, Anthony had enlisted in the Army 3 years prior with dreams of adventure and travel. He had gotten his wish, though perhaps not in the way he had originally envisioned. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with sandy brown hair and green eyes, Anthony possessed the lean, muscular build of someone who had taken military fitness seriously. His service record showed consistent high marks in physical training, marksmanship, and tactical exercises, but nothing had prepared him for the savage brutality of the Arctic environment. The 1st Brigade Combat Team, 25th Infantry Division, Arctic Wolves, had been deployed to Fort Greely, Alaska, for their annual Arctic warfare training exercise, codenamed Operation Polar Strike. This was not Anthony's first Arctic deployment, but it was his first time participating in such an extensive winter survival and combat readiness drill. The exercise was designed to test the unit's ability to operate effectively in extreme cold weather conditions, simulating potential conflict scenarios in the high Arctic, where climate change and geopolitical tensions were opening new theaters of operation. Fort Greely itself sprawled across a vast tract of land, approximately 100 miles southeast of Fairbanks, positioned strategically in the heart of Alaska's interior. The base served primarily as a missile defense installation, home to the ground-based mid-course defense system, but its remote location and harsh climate made it an ideal training ground for Arctic warfare exercises. The landscape surrounding the fort consisted of endless miles of taiga and tundra, broken by frozen rivers, scattered stands of spruce and birch, and rolling hills that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The specific area designated for Operation Polar Strike lay 35 miles northeast of the main base, accessible only by snow machine or tracked vehicle during the winter months. The terrain in this sector was particularly challenging, characterized by deep snowdrifts that could reach 15 feet in depth, hidden crevasses carved by seasonal melt patterns, and dense thickets of stunted trees that created natural obstacles and limited visibility. Weather conditions in the region were notoriously unpredictable, with sudden blizzards capable of reducing visibility to 0 and temperature swings of 30 degrees or more within a matter of hours. Accompanying Anthony on this mission were 14 other soldiers, each bringing their own unique background and expertise to the operation. Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Rodriguez, the squad leader, was a 32-year-old career soldier from San Antonio, Texas, with over 12 years of military experience and multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with black hair pulled back in a regulation bun and dark brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing, Rodriguez had earned her stripes through a combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to the welfare of her soldiers. She had volunteered for Arctic training specifically because she recognized the growing strategic importance of cold weather operations in modern military doctrine. Sergeant First Class David Michael Thompson, 29, served as the unit's communications specialist and assistant squad leader. Originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Thompson was one of the few members of the squad who had grown up in a cold climate, though even his Midwest winters paled in comparison to the Arctic conditions they now faced. With brown hair cut in a standard military fade and blue eyes behind military-issue glasses, Thompson possessed the methodical, detail-oriented personality that made him exceptionally effective at maintaining communication links and coordinating logistics in challenging environments. Specialist Jennifer Marie Hayes, 25, functioned as the squad's medic, carrying the additional responsibility that came with being the person everyone would turn to in a medical emergency. Born in Portland, Oregon, Hayes had joined the military after completing 2 years of pre-medical studies at Portland State University. Standing 5 feet 4 inches with auburn hair and freckles across her pale complexion, she had demonstrated exceptional competence in field medicine and had earned the respect of her fellow soldiers through her calm professionalism under pressure. The remaining soldiers included Corporal James Andrew Wilson from Detroit, Michigan, Specialist Robert Lee Jackson from Birmingham, Alabama, Private First Class Michael Stephen Chen from Los Angeles, California, Private First Class Sarah Elizabeth Torres from Phoenix, Arizona, Corporal Brian Keith Murphy from Boston, Massachusetts, Specialist Amanda Rose Thompson from Nashville, Tennessee, Private Tyler James Anderson from Seattle, Washington, Private First Class Kevin Michael O'Brien from Chicago, Illinois, Corporal Lisa Marie Gonzalez from Denver, Colorado, Specialist Marcus Anthony Williams from Atlanta, Georgia, and Private Daniel Scott Campbell from Portland, Maine. Each soldier had been selected for the exercise based on their performance in previous training operations and their potential for advancement in Arctic warfare specializations. The unit represented a diverse cross-section of American geography and military occupational specialties brought together by the common goal of mastering the skills necessary to operate effectively in one of the world's most hostile environments. The exercise had begun 4 days earlier on April 8th with a comprehensive briefing on Arctic survival techniques, wildlife awareness, and emergency procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Ann Hawkins, the base commander, had personally addressed the participating soldiers, emphasizing the serious nature of the training and the real dangers present in the Alaskan wilderness. A career officer with 22 years of service, Hawkins had previously commanded units in both Iraq and Afghanistan before accepting the assignment at Fort Greely. Standing 5 feet 8 inches, with graying blonde hair and steel blue eyes, she possessed the commanding presence and tactical acumen that had earned her the respect of subordinates and superiors alike. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hawkins had begun, her voice carrying easily across the assembled soldiers in the base theater, "you are about to undertake training in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The Arctic does not forgive mistakes, and it does not provide second chances. Every decision you make, every piece of equipment you carry, every precaution you take or fail to take could mean the difference between completing this mission successfully and becoming a casualty." The briefing had covered extensive material on cold weather survival, including proper layering techniques, recognition and treatment of hypothermia and frostbite, navigation in whiteout conditions, and emergency shelter construction. Wildlife awareness formed a crucial component of the training, with particular emphasis on polar bears, black bears, brown bears, wolves, and moose. Alaska's bear population was among the densest in North America, and encounters with aggressive animals represented a constant threat for military personnel operating in remote areas. Dr. Margaret Ann Sullivan, a wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who had been contracted to provide specialized training, had delivered a particularly sobering presentation on polar bear behavior and attack patterns. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with silver-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, Dr. Sullivan had spent over 20 years studying Arctic wildlife and had personally documented dozens of polar bear encounters, including several fatal attacks. "Polar bears are the largest land predators on Earth," Dr. Sullivan had explained, advancing through a series of slides showing massive bears in their natural habitat. Adult males can weigh up to 1,700 pounds and stand 11 feet tall on their hind legs. Unlike black bears or brown bears, polar bears view humans as potential prey. They are opportunistic hunters with an incredible sense of smell that can detect food sources from over 20 miles away. The presentation had included detailed information about polar bear anatomy, hunting behavior, and attack patterns. Polar bears possessed several physical characteristics that made them particularly dangerous adversaries. Their massive paws, measuring up to 12 inches in diameter, were equipped with razor-sharp claws up to 4 inches in length. Their powerful jaws contained 42 teeth specifically adapted for tearing flesh and crushing bone, with a bite force exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch. If you encounter a polar bear, Dr. Sullivan had continued, do not run. Running triggers their predatory instincts and guarantees an attack. A polar bear can reach speeds of 25 miles per hour and can maintain that pace for considerable distances. Instead, make yourself appear as large as possible, back away slowly, and make noise to identify yourself as human. If an attack occurs, fight back with everything you have. Unlike encounters with other bear species, playing dead is not effective against polar bears. The soldiers had also received training on proper firearm protocols for wildlife encounters. Each member of the squad would carry an M4 carbine as their primary weapon, along with specialized ammunition designed for large game. Additionally, the squad would have access to bear spray, flares, and emergency signaling devices. The rules of engagement were clear. Wildlife would only be engaged as a last resort to protect human life, and any such incidents would require extensive documentation and investigation. Weather briefings had painted a grim picture of the conditions they could expect to encounter. The National Weather Service office in Fairbanks had issued a series of warnings for the exercise area, including wind chill advisories, blowing snow warnings, and the possibility of sudden temperature drops. Historical weather data for the region showed average April temperatures ranging from -15 to +5 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind speeds frequently exceeding 30 miles per hour. Meteorologist Captain Sarah Jane Mitchell, stationed at Fort Greely's weather office, had provided detailed forecasts and contingency planning information. Standing 5 feet 7 inches with brown hair and green eyes, Captain Mitchell had earned degrees in atmospheric sciences from Penn State University before commissioning as an officer in the Air Force Weather Agency. Her expertise in Arctic meteorology had made her an invaluable resource for military operations in Alaska. The weather in this region can change dramatically in a matter of minutes, Captain Mitchell had warned during her briefing. Clear skies can give way to complete whiteout conditions with virtually no warning. Temperature inversions can create pockets of extremely cold air that can cause severe frostbite in seconds. Your survival depends on constant vigilance and immediate response to changing conditions. The first 3 days of the exercise had proceeded according to plan, with the soldiers establishing base camps, practicing winter survival techniques, and conducting simulated combat operations in Arctic conditions. The training scenarios had been designed to test their ability to move effectively through deep snow, maintain equipment functionality in extreme cold, and coordinate tactical operations while wearing bulky winter gear. Anthony had performed well during the initial phases of the exercise, demonstrating particular aptitude for winter navigation and cold weather equipment maintenance. His squad leaders had noted his positive attitude and willingness to assist fellow soldiers who were struggling with the harsh conditions. Several times, Anthony had volunteered for additional duties and had shown leadership potential that suggested he might be ready for promotion to corporal in the near future. The squad had established their primary base camp in a clearing approximately 8 miles northeast of their starting point, protected from the worst of the wind by a stand of mature spruce trees. The camp consisted of 4 Arctic-rated tents arranged in a defensive perimeter, with a central area for equipment storage and food preparation. Each tent was equipped with portable heating units designed to maintain interior temperatures above freezing, though the soldiers were required to rotate guard duties throughout the night to monitor for equipment failures and potential wildlife encounters. On the evening of April 11th, the squad had received new orders via encrypted radio communication from the exercise command post. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had gathered the soldiers around a map board illuminated by red-filtered flashlights to preserve night vision while explaining the next phase of their mission. "Gentlemen and ladies," Rodriguez had begun, her breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air despite the windbreak provided by the tent. "We have received orders to establish an observation post on Hill 247, approximately 12 kilometers to the northeast of our current position. Intelligence reports suggest simulated enemy forces are operating in that sector, and we are tasked with conducting reconnaissance and surveillance operations." Hill 247 was a prominent terrain feature, rising approximately 400 feet above the surrounding landscape, providing excellent observation capabilities across the entire northern sector of the exercise area. However, reaching the hill would require the squad to traverse some of the most challenging terrain in the region, including several frozen creek beds, dense thickets of trees and undergrowth, and areas known to be frequented by wildlife. The movement to Hill 247 was scheduled to begin at 0600 hours on April 12th, with the squad traveling in 2-man buddy teams to reduce the risk of personnel becoming separated in poor visibility conditions. Each team would maintain visual contact with adjacent teams, and radio check-ins would occur every 30 minutes to ensure accountability of all personnel. Anthony had been assigned as the buddy of Private Daniel Scott Campbell, a 23-year-old soldier from Portland, Maine, who had joined the Army 18 months earlier. Campbell, standing 5 feet 10 inches with red hair and a fair complexion marked by numerous freckles, had grown up in a fishing family and possessed considerable experience with cold weather and outdoor survival. The 2 soldiers had developed a good working relationship during previous training exercises, and their complementary skills made them an effective team. The night of April 11th had been particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping to -42 degrees Fahrenheit and wind gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour. The soldiers had rotated guard duties in 2-hour shifts, with each guard responsible for monitoring the perimeter, checking equipment, and watching for signs of wildlife activity. Anthony had drawn the 0200 to 0400 guard shift, spending 2 hours moving slowly around the camp perimeter while fighting off the numbing effects of the extreme cold. During his guard duty, Anthony had noticed several sets of tracks in the snow around the camp perimeter, including what appeared to be large paw prints that Dr. Sullivan's training had taught him to recognize as potentially belonging to a polar bear. The tracks were partially filled with blowing snow, making it difficult to determine their age, but their size and spacing suggested an animal of considerable size had passed through the area sometime within the previous 24 hours. Anthony had immediately reported the tracks to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had conducted her own examination using a flashlight with a red filter to avoid compromising night vision. Rodriguez had considerable experience with wildlife tracking from her childhood in South Texas, where her father had been an avid hunter, and she had confirmed Anthony's assessment that the tracks likely belonged to a large bear. "We'll maintain heightened alert status for the remainder of the night," Rodriguez had decided after examining the tracks. "Double the watch and ensure all personnel are aware of the potential wildlife presence. I want weapons readily accessible but not chambered, unless we have visual contact with a threat. The remainder of the night had passed without incident, though several soldiers reported hearing unusual sounds in the darkness beyond the camp perimeter. The sounds had been difficult to identify over the constant wind, but they had included what might have been heavy breathing, the snap of breaking branches, and the soft sound of something large moving through the snow. Dawn on April 12th had brought little improvement in the weather conditions, with overcast skies, blowing snow, and temperatures that had risen only slightly to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility was limited to approximately 200 meters due to the blowing snow, and weather reports from Fort Greely indicated that conditions were expected to deteriorate further throughout the day. The soldiers had begun their preparations for movement at 0530 hours, conducting equipment checks, reviewing route plans, and ensuring all personnel were properly dressed for the harsh conditions. The standard Arctic clothing ensemble consisted of multiple layers designed to trap warm air while allowing moisture to escape, including moisture-wicking base layers, insulating middle layers, and wind-resistant outer shells. Anthony had double-checked his equipment load, which included his M4 carbine with 6 30-round magazines, cold-weather lubricants to prevent weapon malfunctions, an emergency medical kit, 3 days of meals ready to eat, a sleeping bag rated to -40 degrees, emergency shelter materials, navigation equipment, communication devices, and specialized Arctic survival gear. The total weight of his equipment exceeded 60 pounds, a significant burden when moving through deep snow and difficult terrain. At exactly 0600 hours, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had given the signal to begin movement, and the squad had departed their base camp in the predetermined formation. The lead team consisted of Rodriguez and Sergeant Thompson, followed by teams spaced approximately 50 meters apart to maintain visual contact while reducing the risk of a single incident affecting multiple personnel. Anthony and Campbell had been assigned to the 4th position in the movement order, placing them approximately 200 meters behind the lead element. This position provided them with the advantage of following established tracks through the snow, while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid crowding that could compromise the formation's security. The initial phase of movement had proceeded smoothly, with the soldiers making steady progress through the relatively open terrain surrounding their base camp. The snow was deep but firm enough to support their weight with snowshoes, and the moderate wind allowed for adequate visibility between team positions. However, as the squad moved deeper into the wilderness, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Dense thickets of stunted spruce and birch trees created natural obstacles that forced frequent changes in direction, and hidden depressions in the snow led to several soldiers stepping into holes that left them temporarily immobilized. Approximately 3 hours into the movement, at 0900 hours, the squad encountered their first significant obstacle in the form of a frozen creek bed that ran perpendicular to their planned route. The creek was approximately 30 feet wide and had been carved deep into the landscape by years of seasonal flooding, creating steep banks on both sides that would be difficult to negotiate while carrying heavy equipment loads. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called a halt to assess the situation and determine the best crossing point. The soldiers took advantage of the break to rest, hydrate, and check their equipment for any cold weather malfunctions. Several weapons had developed minor icing issues that required immediate attention to prevent more serious problems from developing. During the halt, Specialist Hayes had approached Anthony to check on a minor equipment issue he had reported earlier. Hayes, serving as the squad medic, was responsible for monitoring the health and welfare of all personnel, particularly watching for early signs of cold weather injuries that could rapidly become serious in Arctic conditions. "How are you feeling, Miller?" Hayes had asked, examining Anthony's face for signs of frostbite while he adjusted his equipment load. "Any numbness in your fingers or toes? Any trouble with your breathing?" Anthony had assured her that he was managing the conditions well, though he admitted to feeling the effects of the extreme cold more than he had anticipated. Despite his excellent physical condition, the combination of heavy equipment loads, difficult terrain, and brutal weather conditions was taking a toll on all members of the squad. After examining the creek crossing for several minutes, Rodriguez had identified a location where the banks were less steep and fallen trees provided natural bridges across the water. However, the crossing would require the soldiers to move in single file and would temporarily break up the buddy team formations, creating a potential vulnerability. "We'll cross one team at a time," Rodriguez had decided, with security provided by the teams on both sides of the creek. Each team will establish a defensive position after crossing to cover the movement of subsequent teams. The creek crossing had consumed nearly an hour, with each team carefully negotiating the steep banks and icy surface while maintaining security against potential threats. Several soldiers had experienced minor slips and falls, but no serious injuries had occurred, and all equipment had been successfully transported across the obstacle. By 10:30 hours, the entire squad had successfully crossed the creek and had resumed movement toward Hill 247. However, the delay had put them behind their planned timeline, and the deteriorating weather conditions were making navigation increasingly difficult. The overcast sky had darkened, and snow had begun falling more heavily, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. As the squad continued northeast through increasingly dense terrain, they began encountering more frequent signs of wildlife activity. In addition to the bear tracks they had observed at the base camp, soldiers reported seeing tracks that appeared to belong to wolves, moose, and various smaller animals. The concentration of tracks suggested they were moving through an area that served as a natural wildlife corridor, possibly following traditional migration routes or leading to important feeding areas. At approximately 11:45 hours, as the squad was negotiating a particularly dense thicket of trees, Private Campbell had reported experiencing equipment problems with his radio that required immediate attention. The radio was essential for maintaining communication with other team members and with the exercise command post, and a failure could compromise the safety of the entire squad. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had called another halt, while Sergeant Thompson attempted to diagnose and repair Campbell's radio malfunction. The soldiers had taken positions in a defensive perimeter while the technical work was conducted, but the dense vegetation limited visibility and created multiple potential approach routes for wildlife or other threats. During the radio repair effort, which lasted approximately 20 minutes, several soldiers reported hearing sounds in the surrounding forest that suggested the presence of large animals moving through the area. The sounds were partially masked by the wind and falling snow, but they included the distinctive sound of heavy footsteps in snow and the occasional snap of breaking branches under significant weight. Anthony had been positioned on the northern perimeter of the defensive formation, providing security while Thompson worked on the radio repairs. From his position, he had an excellent view across a small clearing that extended approximately 100 meters to the north, though the falling snow and poor lighting conditions limited his ability to detect movement at distance. It was during this security halt that Anthony had observed movement in the tree line on the far side of the clearing that had initially appeared to be wind-blown snow or shifting shadows. However, continued observation had revealed what appeared to be a large white form moving slowly through the trees, approximately 200 meters away. Anthony had immediately alerted Campbell to the potential wildlife sighting and had attempted to get a better view using the optical scope mounted on his M4 carbine. Through the scope, he had been able to confirm that the movement was indeed a large animal, though the distance and poor visibility had made positive identification difficult. "Campbell," Anthony had whispered, keeping his voice low to avoid alerting any nearby wildlife. I've got eyes on something big moving through the trees at about 200 meters north. Can't get a positive identification from this range, but it's definitely large enough to be a bear." Campbell had immediately moved to Anthony's position to confirm the sighting while maintaining radio contact with the rest of the squad. The standard operating procedure for wildlife encounters required immediate notification of squad leadership and implementation of protective measures to prevent dangerous interactions. However, before Campbell could establish visual contact with the animal Anthony had spotted, Sergeant Thompson had successfully completed the radio repairs, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had given the order to resume movement. The timing was unfortunate, as it meant the squad would be moving through an area where they had confirmed the presence of potentially dangerous wildlife. Rodriguez had been informed of Anthony's wildlife sighting and had made the decision to alter their route slightly to avoid the area where the animal had been observed. However, the dense terrain and limited visibility made it difficult to maintain significant distance from potential wildlife locations, while still making progress toward their objective. The squad had resumed movement at 12:10 hours, with heightened alertness for wildlife encounters and weapons at the ready. The falling snow had intensified, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters and making it increasingly difficult to maintain visual contact between team members. As they moved through the forest, the soldiers had to navigate around numerous obstacles, including fallen trees, dense undergrowth, and areas where the snow had drifted to depths exceeding 6 feet. The difficult terrain forced frequent changes in direction and spacing, gradually stretching out the formation as faster-moving teams pulled ahead of those struggling with particularly challenging sections. At approximately 12:45 hours, Anthony and Campbell had encountered a section of terrain where a recent windstorm had brought down several large trees, creating a complex obstacle course that required careful navigation. The fallen trees were covered with snow and ice, making them extremely slippery and dangerous to cross, while the gaps between them were filled with deep snow that could conceal additional hazards. As they worked their way through the fallen timber, Anthony and Campbell had gradually become separated from the team ahead of them, who had found a more direct route through the obstacle field. The distance had increased slowly, but by the time they cleared the fallen trees, they could no longer maintain visual contact with the other soldiers. Campbell had attempted to re-establish radio contact with the rest of the squad, but had encountered interference that made communication difficult. The combination of the dense forest canopy, falling snow, and the electronic effects of the extreme cold had created conditions that significantly degraded radio performance. "Miller, we need to pick up the pace and catch up with the others," Campbell had said, checking his compass to ensure they were still moving in the correct direction. "This weather is getting worse, and we don't want to get separated from the squad in these conditions." Anthony had agreed, and the two soldiers had increased their pace, following the tracks left by the teams ahead of them while scanning the surrounding forest for signs of wildlife or other threats. The tracks were becoming increasingly difficult to follow as the falling snow filled them in, and several times they had to stop to ensure they were still on the correct route. It was at 13:15 hours, as Anthony and Campbell were crossing a small clearing approximately 400 meters behind the rest of their squad, that the situation rapidly deteriorated. Anthony had been leading the movement across the clearing when Campbell's snowshoe binding had failed, causing him to stumble and fall face first into the deep snow. The binding failure was a serious equipment malfunction that required immediate repair, as Campbell would be unable to move effectively through the deep snow without properly functioning snowshoes. Anthony had stopped to help with the repair, setting down his weapon and removing his heavy gloves to work on the small mechanical components of the binding system. As the two soldiers worked on the snowshoe repair, they were unaware that they were being observed by a massive polar bear that had been following their squad for the past several hours. The bear, an adult male weighing approximately 1,400 pounds and standing 9 feet tall at the shoulder, had been attracted by the sounds and scents associated with the human activity in its territory. Polar bears possess an extraordinary sense of smell that allows them to detect potential food sources from incredible distances, and the combination of human scents, food odors, and the disturbance caused by the squad's movement had drawn the bear's attention. Unlike black bears or brown bears, which typically avoid human contact, polar bears view humans as potential prey and will actively stalk and attack when the opportunity presents itself. The bear had been following the squad's trail for over 2 hours, staying far enough behind to avoid detection while gathering information about the number of humans, their movement patterns, and their level of alertness. Polar bears are intelligent predators that often conduct extended surveillance of potential prey before launching an attack, and this individual had demonstrated the patience and cunning that made it such an effective hunter. As Anthony and Campbell worked on the snowshoe repair, the bear had moved into position approximately 100 meters away, concealed by a dense thicket of trees and undergrowth. From this position, the bear had an excellent view of the two soldiers and could approach using the natural cover provided by the terrain. The attack began at 13:23 hours, when the bear initiated a charge across the clearing, covering the distance to Anthony and Campbell in a matter of seconds. Polar bears are capable of reaching speeds of 25 miles per hour, even in deep snow, and their massive size and strength allow them to crash through obstacles that would stop most other animals. Anthony was the first to become aware of the attack, hearing the sound of the bear's approach over the wind and snow. He looked up from the snowshoe repair to see a massive white form charging directly toward them, moving with the fluid grace and terrifying speed that characterized polar bear attacks. "Bear!" Anthony shouted, scrambling to reach his weapon while simultaneously trying to warn Campbell of the imminent danger. The M4 carbine was lying in the snow approximately 6 feet away, and Anthony realized with horror that he would not be able to reach it before the bear reached their position. Campbell looked up at Anthony's warning and immediately understood the gravity of their situation. The bear was less than 50 meters away and closing rapidly, its massive head lowered and powerful legs driving it forward through the snow with frightening efficiency. Campbell attempted to stand and move toward his own weapon, but the broken snowshoe binding caused him to stumble again, leaving him partially immobilized in the deep snow. The bear reached Anthony's position first, rising up on its hind legs to its full height of 11 feet before bringing its massive forelegs down in a crushing blow that caught Anthony across the chest and shoulder. The impact lifted Anthony completely off his feet and threw him backward into the snow, while the bear's razor-sharp claws tore through his Arctic clothing and into the flesh beneath. Anthony's body armor had provided some protection against the initial impact, but the bear's claws had found gaps in the protective covering and had inflicted severe lacerations across his chest, shoulder, and left arm. The force of the blow had also caused significant internal injuries, including broken ribs and possible damage to internal organs. As Anthony struggled to regain his footing and reach his weapon, the bear had turned its attention to Campbell, who was still trapped in the snow by his malfunctioning equipment. Campbell had managed to draw his sidearm, a Beretta M9 pistol, and had fired several shots at the bear from a distance of less than 10 feet. The pistol rounds had struck the bear in the chest and shoulder, but the combination of the bear's thick hide, dense fur, and layer of fat had prevented the bullets from reaching vital organs. Instead of deterring the attack, the gunshots had only served to further enrage the massive predator, which responded by attacking Campbell with even greater ferocity. The bear's jaws closed around Campbell's right leg, just above the knee, and the crushing force of the bite immediately shattered the bones and severed major blood vessels. Campbell's scream of pain and terror echoed across the clearing as the bear began shaking him violently, using the same technique it would employ to kill seals or other natural prey. Anthony, despite his own severe injuries, had managed to reach his M4 carbine and had chambered a round while taking aim at the bear's head from a distance of approximately 15 feet. The specialized ammunition designed for large game had significantly more stopping power than Campbell's pistol rounds, and Anthony knew that accurate shot placement would be critical for stopping the attack. Anthony's first shot struck the bear in the neck, causing it to release Campbell and turn its attention back toward him. The wound was serious but not immediately fatal, and the bear's response was to charge directly at Anthony with the full fury of a wounded predator defending itself. The second shot struck the bear center mass, penetrating deep into the chest cavity and causing significant damage to internal organs. However, the bear's momentum carried it forward, and its massive body collided with Anthony, knocking him down and pinning him beneath nearly 1,400 pounds of wounded, enraged polar bear. Anthony continued firing his weapon, even as the bear's claws and teeth tore into his body, fighting desperately for his life against an opponent that outweighed him by over 1,000 pounds. His third and fourth shots were fired at point-blank range into the bear's head and neck, finally causing the massive predator to collapse. The entire attack had lasted less than 3 minutes, but the devastation was complete. Campbell lay motionless in the blood-stained snow, his right leg nearly severed and his body showing signs of massive trauma from the bear's attack. Anthony was trapped beneath the dead bear, his body broken and torn from the encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators. The sound of gunfire had carried across the forest despite the wind and falling snow, alerting the rest of the squad that something had gone seriously wrong. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had immediately called a halt and had attempted to re-establish radio contact with Anthony and Campbell, but her calls had gone unanswered. "Thompson, I need you to take point and lead us back toward Miller and Campbell's last known position," Rodriguez had ordered, her training and experience taking over despite the fear and uncertainty of the situation. "Hayes, get your medical gear ready. Wilson and Jackson provide security on our flanks. Everyone else maintain interval and stay alert for additional wildlife." The squad had immediately reversed course and had begun moving rapidly back toward the area where Anthony and Campbell had last been seen. The deteriorating weather conditions made navigation difficult, but Thompson's skills as a communications specialist included advanced land navigation training that proved invaluable in the limited visibility conditions. As the soldiers moved through the forest toward the sound of the gunfire, they had encountered increasing amounts of blood in the snow, indicating that whatever had happened involved serious injuries. The blood trail led directly toward the clearing where Anthony and Campbell had stopped to repair the snowshoe binding. Specialist Hayes had been the first to reach the edge of the clearing and had immediately called out to alert the others to what she was seeing. The scene that greeted the soldiers was one of carnage that would remain burned into their memories for the rest of their lives. "My God," Hayes had whispered, her medical training allowing her to quickly assess the situation while others might have been paralyzed by the shock of what they were witnessing. "Rodriguez, we need immediate medevac. Campbell is alive but critical. Miller is trapped under the bear and unresponsive." The squad had immediately deployed into a defensive perimeter around the clearing, while Hayes had begun triage on the 2 wounded soldiers. Campbell was conscious but in severe shock from blood loss and traumatic injury, while Anthony remained trapped beneath the massive bear carcass and showed no signs of consciousness. Rodriguez had immediately activated the emergency beacon and had begun transmitting distress calls to the exercise command post, while Thompson had established communication with Fort Greely's emergency response center. The remote location and severe weather conditions would complicate any rescue operation, but the severity of the injuries meant that immediate evacuation was essential for survival. Fort Greely emergency. This is Arctic Wolf 6, Rodriguez had transmitted, using the emergency frequency reserved for life-threatening situations. We have 2 soldiers down with severe wildlife attack injuries. Immediate medevac required. Grid coordinates follow. The response from Fort Greely had been immediate and professional, with the Emergency Operations Center activating all available resources for a combat search and rescue mission. However, the weather conditions that had been deteriorating throughout the day had reached the point where helicopter operations were becoming extremely dangerous. Chief Warrant Officer Michael James Peterson, the senior helicopter pilot at Fort Greely, had been monitoring the weather conditions throughout the morning and had been preparing for the possibility that rescue operations might be required. Standing 6 feet tall with graying brown hair and blue eyes, Peterson had over 20 years of experience flying helicopters in Alaska's challenging conditions and had participated in dozens of search and rescue missions. "We're looking at ceiling 0 and visibility less than a quarter mile," Peterson had reported to the Emergency Operations Center. "Wind gusts are exceeding 45 knots with moderate to severe turbulence. These are marginal conditions for helicopter operations, but we can attempt a rescue if we can get a precise location fix." The decision to launch the rescue helicopter had not been made lightly, as it placed additional lives at risk in conditions that were at the very edge of safe flying parameters. However, the severity of the injuries and the remote location meant that ground evacuation would take hours and would likely result in the death of one or both wounded soldiers. While the rescue helicopter was being prepared for departure, Hayes had been working frantically to stabilize Campbell's condition and to free Anthony from beneath the bear carcass. Campbell's injuries were immediately life-threatening, with severe trauma to his right leg, significant blood loss, and signs of shock that indicated possible internal injuries. Hayes had applied a tourniquet to Campbell's leg to control the bleeding, and had started an intravenous line to replace lost fluids and maintain blood pressure. Campbell had remained conscious throughout the initial treatment, though his responses had become increasingly sluggish as shock and blood loss took their toll. "Stay with me, Campbell," Hayes had repeated constantly while working on his injuries. "Help is on the way. You're going to be okay, but I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me." Freeing Anthony from beneath the bear had required the combined efforts of 6 soldiers using improvised leverage to lift the massive carcass enough to pull him clear. Anthony had been unconscious since the final moments of the attack, and his injuries were extensive and immediately life-threatening. The bear's claws had caused deep lacerations across Anthony's chest, shoulders and arms, severing muscles and causing significant damage to blood vessels. The weight of the bear had also caused crushing injuries to his legs and pelvis, and Hayes suspected significant internal bleeding based on the symptoms she was observing. "Miller's in bad shape," Hayes had reported to Rodriguez while beginning emergency treatment. "Multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, signs of severe shock. He needs surgery immediately if we're going to save him." Anthony had remained unconscious throughout Hayes's initial treatment, showing no response to pain stimuli and displaying the grey pallor that indicated severe blood loss and shock. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and his pulse was weak and rapid, classic signs of traumatic shock that could rapidly progress to cardiac arrest. Hayes had worked with the focused intensity that had made her an exceptional medic, applying pressure dressings to control external bleeding while starting intravenous fluid replacement and administering emergency medications to support blood pressure and heart function. However, she knew that her field treatment could only stabilize Anthony temporarily and that he needed immediate surgical intervention to survive. The emergency beacon had been transmitting for over an hour when the soldiers heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching through the storm. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter had launched from Fort Greely, despite weather conditions that were at the absolute limit of safe flying parameters, with Chief Warrant Officer Peterson and his crew risking their own lives to reach the wounded soldiers. The helicopter crew included Peterson as pilot in command, Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Elizabeth Davis as co-pilot, Staff Sergeant Robert Michael Torres as crew chief, and Sergeant Amanda Lynn Foster as the flight medic. Each crew member had extensive experience in Alaska search and rescue operations and had volunteered for the mission despite the dangerous weather conditions. Finding the exact location of the squad in the limited visibility conditions had required exceptional flying skills and the use of emergency navigation beacons. Peterson had been forced to fly at extremely low altitude to maintain visual reference with the ground, while constantly adjusting course to compensate for severe wind gusts and turbulence. Arctic Wolf 6, this is Dustoff 7-1. Peterson had transmitted as the helicopter approached the clearing. We have you in sight. Be advised we have very limited time on station due to weather conditions. We need immediate smoke signal for wind direction and approach path. The soldiers had ignited emergency flares to mark the landing zone and to provide the helicopter crew with wind direction information essential for a safe approach. The clearing where the attack had occurred was barely large enough to accommodate the helicopter, and the surrounding trees created dangerous turbulence that made the landing extremely challenging. Peterson had demonstrated exceptional skill in bringing the helicopter down in the confined area, using every bit of his experience and training to compensate for the difficult conditions. The landing had been hard but successful, and the helicopter crew had immediately begun preparing for medical evacuation of the wounded soldiers. Sergeant Foster, the flight medic, had quickly assessed both patients and had begun coordinating with Hayes to prepare them for transport. Foster had over 10 years of experience as a military medic and had treated numerous trauma cases, but the severity of Anthony and Campbell's injuries had tested even her considerable skills. We need to get them both to Fairbanks Memorial immediately, Foster had determined after her initial assessment. Campbell's stable enough for transport if we can maintain blood pressure and fluid replacement. Miller is critical. Possible internal bleeding, signs of shock, needs immediate surgical intervention. The helicopter had been configured for medical evacuation with specialized equipment for trauma treatment and life support during transport. However, the severe weather conditions meant that the flight to Fairbanks would be extremely dangerous, with limited options for emergency landing if mechanical problems developed. The loading of the wounded soldiers had been accomplished quickly but carefully, with Hayes transferring care to Foster while providing detailed information about the treatment that had been administered in the field. Anthony had remained unconscious throughout the transfer, while Campbell had drifted in and out of consciousness due to pain medication and shock. Dustoff 7-1 departing, Peterson had transmitted, as the helicopter lifted off from the clearing, beginning what would prove to be one of the most challenging flights of his career. The weather conditions had continued to deteriorate during the time on the ground, and the return flight to Fairbanks would require navigating through near-zero visibility conditions while maintaining life support for 2 critically injured patients. The flight to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital had taken 45 minutes under normal conditions, but the severe weather had extended the flight time to over an hour, as Peterson had been forced to reduce speed and altitude to maintain control in the turbulent conditions. Throughout the flight, Foster had worked continuously to maintain Anthony's and Campbell's vital signs while preparing them for immediate surgery upon arrival. Anthony's condition had continued to deteriorate during the flight, with signs of increasing internal bleeding and cardiovascular shock. Foster had administered additional intravenous fluids and emergency medications, but she knew that only immediate surgical intervention could save his life. Campbell's condition had remained more stable during the transport, though he had lost consciousness several times due to pain and shock. The tourniquet applied by Hayes had successfully controlled the bleeding from his leg injury, but Foster was concerned about possible infection and long-term complications from the severe trauma. Fairbanks Memorial Hospital had been alerted to the incoming medical evacuation and had prepared their trauma team for immediate intervention upon the helicopter's arrival. Dr. Patricia Ann Williams, the chief of emergency medicine, had assembled a team of surgeons, anesthesiologists, and trauma specialists to provide immediate care for the wounded soldiers. Dr. Williams, standing 5 feet 8 inches with brown hair and green eyes, had over 15 years of experience treating trauma cases in Alaska and had developed particular expertise in injuries caused by wildlife attacks. Her team had treated numerous bear attack victims over the years and understood the unique challenges presented by such cases. "We have 2 incoming military personnel with severe bear attack injuries," Dr. Williams had announced to her team as they prepared the trauma bays. "Based on the field reports, we're looking at multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, and severe extremity trauma. This is going to require all of our skills and resources." The helicopter had arrived at Fairbanks Memorial at 15:34 hours, and the patients had been immediately transferred to the trauma center, where teams of medical professionals had been standing by. Anthony had been taken directly to the operating room for emergency surgery, while Campbell had been stabilized in the trauma bay before being prepared for his own surgical procedures. Dr. Michael Stephen Rodriguez, the chief of surgery, had taken personal charge of Anthony's case due to the severity and complexity of his injuries. Dr. Rodriguez, standing 6 feet tall with graying black hair and brown eyes, had trained at some of the nation's finest medical institutions and had extensive experience with complex trauma surgery. The initial surgical examination had revealed the full extent of Anthony's injuries, which were even more severe than the field assessment had indicated. The bear's claws had caused deep lacerations that had severed major muscle groups and damaged blood vessels throughout his chest and shoulder area. More critically, the crushing force of the bear's attack had caused significant internal injuries, including a ruptured spleen, liver damage, and possible injury to major blood vessels in the abdomen. "We're looking at massive internal bleeding from multiple sources," Dr. Rodriguez had reported to his surgical team as they began the complex procedure. "Priority 1 is controlling the bleeding and stabilizing blood pressure. Priority 2 is repairing the organ damage. Priority 3 is addressing the external lacerations." The surgery had required over 8 hours to complete, with multiple surgeons working simultaneously to address different aspects of Anthony's injuries. The medical team had been forced to remove Anthony's severely damaged spleen and had repaired significant damage to his liver and other internal organs. The external lacerations had required extensive reconstruction of damaged muscle tissue and hundreds of sutures to close properly. Throughout the surgery, Anthony's condition had remained critical, with several episodes where his blood pressure had dropped to dangerous levels and his heart rhythm had become irregular. The surgical team had administered multiple units of blood and blood products to replace what had been lost during the attack and subsequent internal bleeding. Campbell's surgical treatment had been less complex but still challenging, requiring the expertise of Dr. Amanda Rose Thompson, an orthopedic surgeon specializing in extremity trauma. Dr. Thompson, standing 5 feet 6 inches with blonde hair and blue eyes, had trained specifically in reconstructive surgery for severe traumatic injuries. The bear's bite had caused extensive damage to Campbell's right leg, shattering the femur and severely damaging muscles, blood vessels, and nerves. Dr. Thompson had been forced to insert metal rods and plates to reconstruct the damaged bone, while repairing torn blood vessels and attempting to restore nerve function. "The good news is that we've been able to save the leg," Dr. Thompson had reported after completing Campbell's surgery. "The bad news is that he's going to require extensive rehabilitation and may have permanent limitations in mobility and function." Both soldiers had been transferred to the intensive care unit following their surgeries, where teams of critical care specialists had continued their treatment and monitoring. Anthony had remained unconscious and on life support, while Campbell had regained consciousness but remained heavily sedated for pain management. The news of the bear attack had quickly spread beyond the medical community. Attracting attention from military leadership, wildlife authorities, and media organizations. The incident represented one of the most serious wildlife attacks involving military personnel in Alaska's history, and had raised immediate questions about safety protocols and wildlife management policies. Colonel Patricia Ann Hawkins had arrived at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital within hours of the attack, accompanied by senior staff from Fort Greely and representatives from the Army's Safety Command. The investigation into the incident had begun immediately, with teams of specialists examining every aspect of the mission planning, execution, and response to identify lessons learned and prevent similar incidents in the future. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had also launched its own investigation, led by wildlife biologist Dr. James Michael Anderson, who specialized in human-bear interactions and conflict prevention. Dr. Anderson's preliminary examination of the attack site had revealed important information about the bear's behavior and the circumstances that had led to the encounter. This appears to have been a predatory attack by a large adult male polar bear, Dr. Anderson had reported after examining the evidence at the scene. The bear had been following the military unit for an extended period before selecting 2 isolated soldiers as targets. This type of behavior is consistent with polar bears viewing humans as potential prey rather than responding defensively to a perceived threat. The investigation had also revealed that the bear involved in the attack had been previously known to wildlife authorities, having been spotted in the area on several occasions over the past 2 years. However, the bear had not displayed aggressive behavior toward humans in previous encounters and had not been considered an immediate threat requiring relocation or removal. The media coverage of the incident had been extensive, with news organizations from across the country sending reporters to Alaska to cover the story. The dramatic nature of the attack, combined with the military context and the extreme weather conditions, had created a story that captured national attention and raised public awareness about the challenges faced by military personnel training in Arctic conditions. Sarah Jennifer Martinez, a reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, had been among the first to arrive at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital and had provided detailed coverage of the medical response and ongoing investigation. Martinez, standing 5 feet 5 inches with dark hair and brown eyes, had previously covered numerous stories involving Alaska's wildlife and had developed expertise in the complex relationship between human activities and animal behavior in the state. This incident highlights the very real dangers faced by our military personnel as they prepare for operations in some of the world's most challenging environments, Martinez had written in her initial coverage of the story. The courage displayed by these soldiers, both in the attack itself and in the rescue operations that followed, exemplifies the dedication and professionalism of our armed forces. The investigation into the incident had continued for several days, with teams of specialists examining every aspect of the mission from initial planning through the medical response. The findings had revealed both strengths and weaknesses in current procedures and had led to immediate changes in protocols for military training operations in areas with known wildlife populations. Anthony had remained in critical condition for 5 days following the attack, with his medical team fighting to stabilize his condition and prevent complications from his extensive injuries. His family had been notified immediately and had traveled from California to be at his bedside during the critical period. Anthony's parents, Robert James Miller and Susan Marie Miller, had arrived at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital on April 14th, accompanied by his younger sister, Jennifer Lynn Miller. The family had been devastated by the news of the attack and had maintained a constant vigil at Anthony's bedside throughout his treatment. Robert Miller, a retired construction foreman, had struggled to understand how his son had survived such a horrific encounter with one of nature's most dangerous predators. Susan Miller, a nurse with over 20 years of experience, had been better able to understand the medical aspects of Anthony's treatment, but had been equally shocked by the severity of his injuries. "Anthony has always been strong and determined," Susan Miller had told reporters who had gathered at the hospital. "If anyone can fight through this and recover, it's him. We're just grateful that he's alive and that so many people are working to help him heal." Campbell's recovery had progressed more quickly, though he had faced the prospect of extensive rehabilitation and possible permanent disability. His family had also traveled to Alaska to be with him during his treatment, and he had gradually regained consciousness and begun the long process of physical and emotional recovery. The psychological impact of the attack had been significant for both soldiers, with specialist counselors brought in to help them process the trauma they had experienced. Post-traumatic stress disorder was a common consequence of such violent encounters, and the medical team had been prepared to address these issues as part of the comprehensive treatment plan. Dr. Karen Elizabeth Foster, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, had been assigned to work with both soldiers to help them cope with the emotional aftermath of the attack. Dr. Foster had extensive experience working with military personnel who had experienced combat trauma and understood the unique challenges faced by soldiers recovering from life-threatening injuries. Surviving a predatory animal attack is one of the most psychologically challenging experiences a person can face, Dr. Foster had explained to the families. The sense of helplessness, the proximity to death, and the violent nature of the encounter can create lasting psychological effects that require specialized treatment and support. The broader impact of the incident had extended beyond the immediate medical and psychological consequences for the soldiers involved. The attack had prompted a comprehensive review of military training procedures in Alaska and had led to enhanced safety protocols for future operations in areas with known wildlife populations. General Robert Michael Stevens, Commanding General of U.S. Army Alaska, had ordered an immediate review of all training operations involving potential wildlife encounters. The review had included examination of current protocols, assessment of equipment and procedures, and development of enhanced safety measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. "The safety of our soldiers is our highest priority," General Stevens had stated in a press conference following the incident. "While we cannot eliminate all risks associated with training in challenging environments, we must ensure that we are taking every possible precaution to protect our personnel while maintaining the realism and effectiveness of our training programs." The enhanced safety protocols had included requirements for larger unit sizes in wildlife areas, improved communication equipment, additional medical support, and enhanced wildlife awareness training for all personnel. The changes had been implemented immediately and had been incorporated into training programs throughout the military. The wildlife management community had also responded to the incident with renewed focus on preventing human-bear conflicts in areas where military training operations were conducted. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had increased monitoring of bear populations in the region and had implemented enhanced warning systems to alert military units to the presence of potentially dangerous animals. Anthony's condition had slowly stabilized over the course of 2 weeks, and he had gradually regained consciousness as his body began to heal from the extensive injuries. The recovery process had been long and difficult, requiring multiple additional surgeries and extensive physical therapy to restore function to his damaged limbs and organs. The first time Anthony had regained full consciousness, on April 19th, had been an emotional moment for his family and medical team. His initial reaction had been confusion and disorientation, followed by gradual recollection of the events leading up to the attack. "Where's Campbell?" had been Anthony's first coherent words upon regaining consciousness, demonstrating the bond between soldiers and his concern for his fellow squad member despite his own severe injuries. The medical team had been able to reassure him that Campbell had survived and was recovering in the same hospital. Campbell's recovery had progressed more rapidly, and he had been transferred out of the intensive care unit within a week of the attack. However, he had faced the prospect of extensive rehabilitation to regain function in his damaged leg and had struggled with the psychological impact of the traumatic experience. The reunion between Anthony and Campbell had taken place on April 22nd, when Anthony had been stable enough to be moved to a regular hospital room. The meeting had been emotional for both soldiers, who had shared an experience that few people could fully understand. "I thought we were both going to die out there," Campbell had said during their first conversation since the attack. "I don't know how we survived something like that." The recovery process for both soldiers had extended far beyond their initial hospitalization, requiring months of physical therapy, psychological counseling, and gradual reintegration into normal activities. Anthony's injuries had been more severe and had required additional surgeries to address complications and restore function to his damaged organs and limbs. The investigation into the incident had concluded with a comprehensive report that identified both the factors that had contributed to the attack and the responses that had saved the soldiers' lives. The report had praised the quick thinking and courage of the squad members who had participated in the rescue operation and had highlighted the exceptional skill of the medical personnel who had treated the wounded soldiers. The bear involved in the attack had been a mature male polar bear, estimated to be between 15 and 20 years old, weighing approximately 1,400 pounds. DNA analysis had confirmed that this was the same bear that had been observed in the area on previous occasions, and wildlife experts had concluded that the bear had been following the military unit for several hours before launching its attack. The attack had been classified as predatory rather than defensive, meaning that the bear had actively hunted the soldiers rather than responding to a perceived threat. This distinction was important for understanding the incident and developing strategies to prevent similar encounters in the future. The cost of the rescue operation and medical treatment had exceeded $200,000, including helicopter fuel, medical supplies, hospital costs, and the time of numerous medical and military personnel. However, military leadership had emphasized that no expense was too great when it came to saving the lives of service members. The damaged equipment mentioned in the initial report had included Anthony's and Campbell's personal gear, weapons, and communication equipment that had been destroyed or contaminated during the attack. The total cost of replacing this equipment had been approximately $90,000, though this had been a relatively minor consideration compared to the human costs of the incident. Anthony had eventually been medically retired from the army due to the permanent disabilities resulting from his injuries, though he had made a remarkable recovery considering the severity of the attack. He had required over 2 years of rehabilitation and had undergone several additional surgeries to address complications and improve his mobility and function. Campbell had also been medically retired due to permanent limitations in his leg function, though he had recovered sufficiently to pursue civilian employment and had maintained a positive outlook despite the challenges he faced. Both soldiers had remained close friends and had supported each other throughout their recovery process. The incident had become a case study for military training programs and wildlife management policies, serving as an example of both the dangers present in Arctic environments and the importance of proper emergency response procedures. The lessons learned from the attack had been incorporated into training programs for military personnel worldwide and had contributed to improved safety protocols for operations in wilderness areas. The psychological impact of the incident had extended beyond the soldiers directly involved, affecting their fellow squad members, the medical personnel who had treated them, and the helicopter crew who had risked their lives to perform the rescue. Counseling and support services had been provided to all personnel involved in the incident to help them process the traumatic experience. Dr. Foster had continued to work with Anthony and Campbell throughout their recovery, helping them develop coping strategies for dealing with post-traumatic stress and anxiety related to the attack. The psychological healing had proven to be as important as the physical recovery in enabling both soldiers to rebuild their lives after the incident. Surviving something like this changes you fundamentally, Dr. Foster had explained to the soldiers' families. The goal of treatment is not to make them forget what happened, but to help them integrate the experience into their lives in a way that allows them to move forward and find meaning and purpose despite the trauma they have endured. The incident had also had a significant impact on polar bear research and management policies in Alaska. The attack had provided valuable data about polar bear behavior and had contributed to improved understanding of the factors that can lead to predatory attacks on humans. Dr. Sullivan, the wildlife biologist who had provided the initial training to the military unit, had continued to study the incident and had published several research papers based on the findings. Her work had contributed to improved safety protocols for people working in polar bear habitat and had enhanced understanding of how climate change might be affecting polar bear behavior and distribution. The media coverage of the incident had gradually diminished over time, but the story had continued to resonate with the public as an example of the dangers faced by military personnel and the importance of wilderness safety. Several documentary programs had featured the incident, and it had been included in military training materials as an example of survival and rescue under extreme conditions. Anthony had eventually returned to California, where he had pursued civilian employment and had started a family. Despite his permanent disabilities, he had maintained a positive outlook and had become an advocate for improved wilderness safety and veteran support services. He had spoken at numerous events and had shared his story to help educate others about the realities of military service and the importance of proper emergency preparedness. Campbell had settled in Maine, where he had found employment in the maritime industry and had also started a family. He had remained active in veteran organizations and had worked to support other veterans dealing with service-related injuries and disabilities. The friendship between Anthony and Campbell had remained strong throughout their recovery and beyond, with the two men maintaining regular contact and supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of living with permanent disabilities. Their shared experience had created a bond that transcended the trauma they had endured and had demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The lessons learned from the April 12, 2025 polar bear attack had been incorporated into military doctrine and had influenced wildlife management policies throughout North America. The incident had served as a stark reminder of the dangers present in Arctic environments and had highlighted the importance of proper training, equipment, and emergency response procedures for personnel operating in wilderness areas. The courage and professionalism displayed by all personnel involved in the incident, from the soldiers who had fought for their lives against the bear to the medical team who had saved them, had exemplified the best traditions of military service and had demonstrated the value of proper training and preparation in the face of life-threatening emergencies. The story of Anthony Miller and Daniel Campbell had become more than just an account of a wildlife attack. It had become a testament to human courage, the bonds of military brotherhood, and the dedication of the professionals who risk their own lives to save others. Their survival and recovery had inspired others facing similar challenges and had contributed to improved safety for future generations of military personnel training in the world's most challenging environments. As the investigation had concluded and the immediate medical crisis had passed, the incident had taken its place in the broader context of military history as an example of survival against overwhelming odds and the importance of never giving up in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. The bear attack of April 12, 2025 had ended in tragedy for the polar bear and near tragedy for the two soldiers, but it had also demonstrated the remarkable capacity of humans to survive, adapt, and overcome even the most devastating challenges that nature could present. The next stories. Blood on the Kenai. When nature turned predator. The morning of August 10, 2024, dawned crisp and clear across the Kenai Peninsula, the kind of perfect Alaskan summer day that draws visitors from around the world to experience the raw beauty of America's last frontier. Pastor David Michael Smith stood on the wooden deck of the Resurrection Bay Community Center, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee, watching the early morning mist rise from the spruce-lined shores of Kenai Lake. At 54, David had spent the better part of 2 decades ministering to the scattered communities of south-central Alaska, and he had learned to appreciate these moments of solitude before the chaos of community events began. The annual church picnic had been David's idea 3 years ago, a way to bring together the far-flung members of his congregation who lived scattered across the peninsula's vast wilderness. Some drove hours from remote homesteads to attend Sunday services, and the summer picnic gave them a chance to fellowship outside the confines of the small chapel in Cooper Landing. This year's gathering promised to be the largest yet, with over 40 adults expected to attend the day-long celebration at Bear Creek Recreation Area, a popular camping and picnic spot nestled in the heart of the Chugach National Forest. David had chosen the location carefully, consulting with local rangers and longtime residents about safety protocols. The recreation area sat along the Sterling Highway, easily accessible but surrounded by pristine wilderness that showcased Alaska's natural splendor. Towering Sitka spruce and mountain hemlock created a cathedral-like canopy over the picnic grounds, while Bear Creek itself wound through the site, its crystal-clear waters reflecting the surrounding peaks of the Kenai Mountains. The irony of the creek's name would not be lost on anyone after the events that would unfold later that day. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton arrived at the recreation area at 7:30 that morning, her white Ford pickup truck laden with folding tables, propane grills, and enough food to feed an army. At 61, Margaret had been the unofficial coordinator of church social events for over a decade, a role she embraced with the fierce efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years as a high school principal before retiring to Alaska. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore the kind of sturdy outdoor clothing that marked her as a long-time Alaskan resident rather than a tourist. Margaret had been living on the Kenai Peninsula for 15 years, having moved north from Oregon after her husband Robert passed away from cancer. The solitude and beauty of Alaska had helped heal wounds that time alone could not touch, and she had found purpose in serving the small but tightly knit religious community that Pastor Smith had built. Her own cabin sat on 40 acres of wilderness near Soldotna, and she was no stranger to the realities of living in bear country. She kept a clean camp, stored food properly, and had installed motion-activated lights around her property after several encounters with black bears over the years. As Margaret began setting up the picnic area, she was joined by Thomas James Mitchell, a 47-year-old commercial fisherman whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face told the story of 3 decades working Alaska's dangerous waters. Tom had grown up in Seward, the son of a Norwegian immigrant who had come north in the 1950s, seeking fortune in the salmon runs. Unlike many of his contemporaries who had left Alaska for easier lives in the lower 48, Tom had stayed, building a modest but successful fishing operation that supplied restaurants throughout Anchorage. Tom's connection to Pastor Smith's congregation was relatively recent, dating back only 2 years to a period of profound personal crisis. His 22-year marriage to Sarah had ended in divorce, a casualty of too many months at sea and too little time maintaining the relationships that mattered most. The church had provided Tom with a sense of community during the darkest period of his life, and he had become one of Pastor Smith's most reliable volunteers, always willing to lend his mechanical expertise or simply show up when extra hands were needed. "Morning, Margaret," Tom called out, as he unloaded a gas-powered generator from the back of his pickup. "Looks like we've got perfect weather for this thing." Margaret looked up from the folding table she was wrestling with, accepting Tom's help with grateful efficiency. "Lord willing, it stays that way," she replied, glancing up at the cloudless sky. "Weather Service says we might see some afternoon thunderstorms rolling in from the Gulf, but nothing until evening." As the two worked together to establish the basic infrastructure for the picnic, other volunteers began arriving in a steady stream. Jessica Rose Parker, a 33-year-old emergency room nurse from Central Peninsula Hospital, pulled up in her red Subaru Outback at 8:15, followed closely by Dr. Richard Allen Westbrook, a 60-year-old retired physician who had spent 40 years practicing family medicine in Soldotna before joining the congregation 3 years earlier. Jessica had moved to Alaska from Minnesota 5 years ago, drawn by the adventure and higher pay rates available to medical professionals willing to work in remote areas. Her emergency medicine background made her invaluable during Alaska's long winters, when medical emergencies could become life-or-death situations due to weather delays and transportation challenges. She was petite but tough, with short brown hair and the kind of calm competence that came from years of dealing with trauma and crisis. Her presence at the picnic was partly social, but also practical. Pastor Smith had asked her to serve as the unofficial medical coordinator for the event, a precaution that would prove tragically prescient. Dr. Westbrook represented the kind of medical expertise that was rare in rural Alaska. After completing his residency in Chicago, he had chosen to practice in small-town Alaska, motivated by a desire to make a real difference in an underserved community. His retirement had been reluctant, forced by arthritis that made the long hours and physical demands of rural medicine increasingly difficult. At 60, he remained sharp and capable, though he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was beginning to show the wear of decades of demanding work. The arrival of James Patrick Murphy at 8:30 brought a different energy to the preparation efforts. At 38, Murphy was a bush pilot who operated a small charter service out of Homer, flying hunters, fishermen, and researchers into Alaska's most remote areas. His connection to the congregation was through his wife Linda, a kindergarten teacher who had grown up in the church but was unable to attend the picnic due to a family emergency in Anchorage. Murphy had volunteered to help with setup and stay for the early part of the event before flying back to Homer for a scheduled charter flight. Murphy's aviation background gave him a unique perspective on the Alaskan wilderness. He had seen it from above thousands of times, understood its patterns and dangers in ways that ground-bound residents often missed. He was also one of the few members of the group who carried a weapon as a matter of routine, a .44 Magnum revolver that he wore in a chest holster whenever he was working in the bush. The gun was licensed and legal, a practical tool for someone who often found himself alone in areas where brown bears were a constant presence. As the morning progressed, the picnic area began to take shape. Tables were arranged in a rough circle around a central area where the larger food preparation would take place. Gas grills were positioned downwind from the seating area, and a volleyball net was strung between two sturdy spruce trees. Margaret had brought a portable sound system that Tom connected to his generator, and soon the area was filled with soft background music that mixed pleasantly with the sound of Bear Creek flowing past the eastern edge of the site. The location itself was both beautiful and isolated. Bear Creek Recreation Area occupied roughly 5 acres of partially cleared forest, with designated camping spots scattered throughout the surrounding woods. The main picnic area sat in a natural clearing that had been expanded over the years by the Forest Service, creating an open space roughly the size of a football field. To the north, the area was bounded by a steep hillside covered in dense brush and second-growth timber. To the south, the land sloped gently toward the Sterling Highway, which remained visible through the trees but far enough away to preserve the sense of wilderness solitude. The eastern boundary was defined by Bear Creek itself, a fast-moving stream about 20 feet wide that ran year-round with snowmelt and spring water from the surrounding mountains. The creek was shallow enough to wade across in most places, but the current was strong enough to create a constant background of rushing water that would later mask the sounds of approaching danger. To the west, the picnic area blended gradually into the vast expanse of the Chugach National Forest, thousands of square miles of pristine wilderness that stretched all the way to Prince William Sound. By 9:30, the Corps volunteer group had been joined by Robert Stephen Hayes, a 42-year-old state trooper who lived in Soldotna with his wife Carol and their teenage daughters. Hayes had been with the Alaska State Troopers for 18 years, spending most of his career in rural postings where a single officer might be responsible for patrol areas larger than some states. His connection to Pastor Smith's congregation was both personal and professional. The pastor had provided counseling support during a difficult period when Hayes was struggling with the psychological toll of police work in a state with one of the nation's highest rates of domestic violence and suicide. Hayes brought both expertise and equipment to the gathering. His patrol vehicle contained emergency medical supplies, communications equipment, and other gear that could prove valuable in a crisis. More importantly, his training and experience in emergency response would prove crucial during the chaos that was to come. He was also armed, carrying both his service weapon and a shotgun in his vehicle, though the peaceful nature of the gathering made such precautions seem unnecessary. The arrival of Patricia Ann Collins at 10 o'clock brought the volunteer setup crew to its full strength. Patricia, known to everyone as Patty, was a 55-year-old wildlife biologist who had spent her career studying Alaska's large mammal populations. She worked for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, specializing in brown bear population dynamics and human-bear conflict prevention. Her presence at the picnic was purely social. She had joined the congregation only 6 months earlier after relocating to the Kenai Peninsula from Fairbanks. but her expertise would prove invaluable during the crisis ahead. Patty represented a unique combination of scientific knowledge and practical field experience. She had spent countless hours in Alaska's wilderness, often working alone in areas where brown bears were common. Her research had included radio-collaring studies, population surveys, and investigation of human bear incidents throughout the state. She understood bear behavior better than anyone else who would be present that day, knowledge that would prove both illuminating and heartbreaking as events unfolded. As the setup crew worked together, conversation flowed easily among people who had grown to know each other well through years of shared worship and community involvement. The mood was relaxed and cheerful, with frequent laughter and the kind of easy camaraderie that develops among people who have weathered Alaska's challenges together. Margaret directed operations with gentle efficiency, while Tom handled the heavier physical tasks and technical challenges. Jessica and Dr. Westbrook established a basic first aid station near the center of the activity area, a precaution that seemed overly cautious at the time, but would prove tragically inadequate. The conversation inevitably turned to the wildlife that shared their magnificent surroundings. Patty Collins mentioned that bear activity had been particularly high throughout the peninsula that summer, driven by a poor salmon run that had left many brown bears searching for alternative food sources. She noted that several problem bears had been relocated from populated areas earlier in the season, and that campers and hikers were being advised to exercise extra caution when traveling in the backcountry. "The key thing to remember," Patty explained as she helped arrange folding chairs, "is that bears are intelligent and adaptable. They learn to associate human activity with food opportunities, especially if people aren't careful about food storage and waste management. The bears around here are used to campers and picnickers, but that familiarity can actually make them more dangerous, not less." Her words would prove prophetic, though no one present could have imagined just how dangerous the situation would become. The bear that would soon enter their lives was indeed intelligent and adaptable, and it had learned to associate human activity with food. What made it particularly dangerous was that its recent experiences had also taught it to be unafraid of humans, a combination that wildlife experts recognize as one of the most hazardous situations possible in bear country. The first regular attendees began arriving at the picnic site around 10:30, and Margaret shifted her attention from setup to hospitality. Arthur William Davidson, a 73-year-old retired logger, pulled up in his ancient Ford pickup truck with his wife Dorothy, who was 68, and walked with the aid of a cane following hip replacement surgery the previous winter. The Davidsons had been founding members of Pastor Smith's congregation, drawn to the small church by David's practical, no-nonsense approach to faith that resonated with people who made their living from Alaska's unforgiving landscape. Arthur had spent 45 years in Alaska's logging industry, working primarily in southeast Alaska before moving to the Kenai Peninsula in retirement. His knowledge of forest ecosystems and wildlife behavior was encyclopedic, gained through decades of working in areas where encounters with bears, wolves, and other dangerous animals were routine occupational hazards. He was a quiet man who spoke rarely but commanded respect when he chose to share his insights. Dorothy had worked as a seamstress and later as a school secretary, raising 3 children who had all eventually moved to the lower 48 for college and careers, but returned regularly to visit their parents in the wilderness they loved. The Davidsons were followed by Michael Robert Turner, a 44-year-old aircraft mechanic who worked at the regional airport in Kenai. Michael had moved to Alaska from Michigan 8 years earlier, seeking adventure and better employment opportunities in a field where skilled mechanics were in high demand. His technical expertise with engines and mechanical systems had made him invaluable to the church community, where he volunteered his services to maintain the aging heating system and other equipment at the chapel. Michael's wife, Jennifer, had passed away from breast cancer 2 years earlier, a loss that had brought him closer to the congregation as he struggled to rebuild his life as a single man in his 40s. The church community had rallied around him during Jennifer's illness and after her death, providing both practical support and emotional comfort during the darkest period of his life. His attendance at church events was partly about faith, but also about maintaining the social connections that had helped him survive his grief. As the morning progressed, the arriving attendees represented a cross-section of the peninsula's residents. Frank Joseph Kozlowski, a 67-year-old retired commercial fisherman, arrived with his wife Helen, a former teacher who had spent 30 years in Alaska's rural schools. The Kozlowskis had moved to Alaska in the 1970s as young newlyweds seeking adventure and economic opportunity. Frank had built a successful fishing operation over 3 decades, while Helen had taught in villages scattered across the state's vast interior. Their arrival was followed by Susan Marie Bradley, a 39-year-old social worker who dealt primarily with Alaska's complex issues around domestic violence and substance abuse in rural communities. Susan was relatively new to both Alaska and the congregation, having moved north from Seattle 18 months earlier. Her work brought her into contact with some of Alaska's harshest realities, and she had found solace in the supportive community that Pastor Smith had built. The steady arrival of congregants continued throughout the late morning, each bringing their own stories and contributions to the gathering. William Charles Anderson, a 51-year-old heavy equipment operator who worked on highway maintenance crews, arrived with coolers full of fresh-caught salmon that he had pulled from the Kenai River the previous day. Linda K. Martinez, a 46-year-old postal worker who served rural communities throughout the peninsula, brought homemade desserts that had become legendary at church gatherings. By 11:30, the picnic area was bustling with activity as nearly 30 adults worked together to complete the final preparations for what promised to be the most successful church gathering in years. Pastor Smith moved among his congregants with the easy warmth that had made him beloved throughout the community, checking on preparations, but mostly just enjoying the fellowship that such events made possible. The pastor's own story was one of gradual migration northward, following a calling that had taken him from his native Texas through increasingly remote posts in Wyoming, Montana, and finally, Alaska. His 23 years of ministry in Alaska had taught him to appreciate the unique challenges and rewards of serving a scattered rural community. Unlike urban pastors who might see their congregants several times a week, David often went months without seeing some of his flock, making gatherings like the annual picnic precious opportunities for genuine community building. As noon approached, the appointed start time for the official festivities, the weather remained perfect. The temperature had climbed to a comfortable 72 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep insects at bay without creating any discomfort. The sky remained cloudless, except for a few high cirrus clouds that stretched across the northern horizon like brushstrokes on blue canvas. The surrounding forest provided both beauty and shelter, creating an intimate outdoor sanctuary that seemed perfectly designed for the kind of fellowship the group was seeking. The lunch preparations began in earnest as Margaret and her volunteer kitchen crew fired up the propane grills and began cooking the salmon that William Anderson had contributed. The smell of grilling fish mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee and the pine scent of the surrounding forest to create an atmosphere of perfect contentment. Conversation flowed easily among people who had shared both the hardships and joys of life in Alaska's challenging environment. Dr. Richard Westbrook found himself in conversation with Patty Collins about the wildlife management challenges facing the peninsula. Both had professional reasons to be concerned about increasing human-bear conflicts, and their discussion touched on some of the factors that were contributing to the problem. Poor salmon runs due to changing ocean conditions were forcing bears to seek alternative food sources, often bringing them into closer contact with human populations. Climate change was also affecting traditional food cycles, creating unpredictable situations where bears might be more desperate and therefore more dangerous than usual. The real problem, Patty explained to the small group that had gathered around their conversation, is that we've created a situation where bears are losing their natural fear of humans. When they learn that human areas provide easy access to food, they become what we call food conditioned. And once that happens, they start to see humans as competitors rather than threats to be avoided. Her words carried the weight of scientific expertise, but they were delivered in the casual tone of academic discussion rather than warning. None of the people listening could have imagined that they were about to become unwilling participants in a real-world demonstration of the principles she was describing. The bear that was even then moving through the forest toward their location had indeed become food-conditioned, and its behavior patterns had been shaped by exactly the kind of human-bear interactions that Patty had spent her career studying. Unknown to the peaceful gathering, their activities had been under observation for nearly 2 hours. The brown bear that would soon shatter their tranquil morning had first detected the human presence around 10 o'clock, drawn by the sounds and smells of cooking food that carried for miles through the still forest air. The bear was an adult male, approximately 8 years old and weighing close to 600 pounds. He was not particularly large by Kodiak or coastal brown bear standards, but he represented a formidable predator by any measure. This particular bear had a history with humans that had shaped his behavior in dangerous ways. Earlier that summer, he had been involved in 2 separate incidents at campgrounds along the Sterling Highway, raiding food supplies and showing little fear of human attempts to scare him away. Wildlife officials had considered relocating the animal, but budget constraints and the logistical challenges of safely capturing a large brown bear had delayed action. The decision to postpone intervention would prove tragically costly. The bear's approach to the picnic area was methodical and intelligent. He had learned through experience to avoid direct confrontation with large groups of humans, preferring to wait for opportunities when food sources were less well defended. His reconnaissance of the picnic site began from the forested hillside to the north, where he could observe the human activity while remaining concealed in the thick underbrush and second-growth timber. From his hidden vantage point, the bear could see the entire layout of the gathering. His keen intelligence allowed him to assess the situation with the calculation of an experienced predator. He noted the locations of the food preparation areas, identified potential escape routes, and evaluated the threat level posed by the humans below. What he saw was a large group of people who appeared relaxed and unaware of his presence, focused on their social activities rather than maintaining vigilance for potential threats. The bear's behavior during this observation period demonstrated the sophisticated intelligence that makes brown bears both magnificent and dangerous. He remained motionless for long periods, using his excellent hearing and sense of smell to gather information about the humans below. He could detect individual scents, distinguish between adults and children, and even identify specific types of food being prepared. The smell of grilling salmon was particularly attractive, triggering instinctive responses that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution. As the noon hour approached and the food preparation intensified, the bear began to show signs of increasing agitation. His observation period had convinced him that the human group represented an opportunity rather than a threat, and his hunger was overriding the caution that might have kept him hidden until the humans departed. The poor salmon run that summer had left him undernourished compared to previous years, and the smell of easily accessible protein was becoming irresistible. The bear's movement from observation to active stalking began gradually around 11:45. He descended the hillside slowly, using the natural cover provided by fallen logs and dense vegetation to mask his approach. His progress was virtually silent, despite his massive size, a testament to the evolutionary adaptations that had made his species successful predators for millions of years. He paused frequently to assess the situation, ensuring that his approach remained undetected while positioning himself for what his instincts told him would be a successful food acquisition. The tragedy that was about to unfold represented a convergence of factors that wildlife experts recognize as creating the perfect storm for human-bear conflict. A food-conditioned bear with previous positive experiences raiding human food sources encountered a large group of people who were focused on social activities rather than safety vigilance. The remote location meant that help would be far away when crisis struck, while the peaceful nature of the gathering had led to a relaxed attitude toward the precautions that might have prevented disaster. At 12:05 in the afternoon, as Pastor Smith was preparing to offer the blessing that would officially begin the picnic festivities, the brown bear emerged from the forest edge, approximately 50 yards to the north of the main gathering area. His appearance was sudden and shocking, transforming a peaceful summer afternoon into a scene of terror that would be remembered for generations by those who survived it. The bear's initial emergence from the tree line created a moment of stunned silence among the picnickers. For several seconds, human minds struggled to process what their eyes were seeing. The massive animal stood upright briefly, rising to his full height of nearly 7 feet as he assessed the situation, before dropping back to all fours and beginning a purposeful advance toward the food preparation area. Margaret Thornton was the first to react, her voice cutting through the shocked silence with a scream that would haunt her survivors for years to come. "Bear! There's a bear!" Her words shattered the peaceful atmosphere like breaking glass, transforming 30-plus adults from relaxed picnickers into potential prey animals in the space of a heartbeat. The bear's response to Margaret's scream was immediate and telling. Rather than fleeing as a wild bear might have done, he increased his pace toward the food area, his behavior confirming Patty Collins' worst fears about food-conditioned animals. This was not a bear that was startled by human presence. This was a bear that had learned to associate human activity with feeding opportunities, and he was not going to be deterred by shouting. Tom Mitchell's survival instincts, honed by decades of dangerous work on Alaska's waters, kicked in immediately. He began shouting for people to move toward the vehicles while simultaneously grabbing one of the folding chairs and raising it as a potential weapon. His actions demonstrated the kind of clear thinking under pressure that would prove crucial during the chaos ahead, though nothing could have prepared him for the speed and ferocity of what was about to unfold. Dr. Richard Westbrook's medical training had taught him to remain calm during emergencies, but nothing in his 40 years of practice had prepared him for the reality of facing a charging brown bear. He found himself frozen for several critical seconds, his mind struggling to shift from the peaceful social gathering to a life-or-death survival situation. When he finally began to move, it was toward Jessica Parker and the first aid supplies, his instincts telling him that medical intervention would soon be desperately needed. Jessica Parker's emergency room experience served her well in the initial moments of crisis. While others stood frozen or began to panic, she immediately began moving toward the vehicles while mentally cataloging the location of every person at the gathering. Her trauma training had taught her to think systematically, even in chaotic situations, and she was already calculating distances to potential safety zones and assessing the resources available for treating injuries. State Trooper Robert Hayes responded with the trained reflexes of an experienced law enforcement officer. His first action was to draw his service weapon, though he hesitated to fire immediately due to the proximity of civilians and the possibility that gunshots might further agitate the bear. His second action was to begin shouting commands, attempting to impose some order on the chaos while positioning himself between the bear and the largest concentration of people. The bear's advance toward the food area brought him into direct conflict with several picnickers who had been serving food when he emerged from the forest. William Anderson, the heavy equipment operator who had contributed the salmon, found himself directly in the animal's path as he attempted to reach his pickup truck. The bear's fixation on the grilling salmon put William in immediate mortal danger, a situation that was about to escalate beyond anyone's worst nightmare. James Murphy, the bush pilot, reacted with the split-second decision-making that had kept him alive during years of flying in Alaska's dangerous conditions. He drew his .44 Magnum revolver and moved toward a position where he could potentially fire without endangering other people. His experience in the Alaskan wilderness had taught him that bears could cover ground with shocking speed, and he understood that the window for effective intervention was measured in seconds rather than minutes. The bear's charge began in earnest when William Anderson made the mistake of running directly away from the animal. The sudden movement triggered predatory instincts that overrode any remaining caution, and the 600-pound predator accelerated toward his target with the speed of a racehorse. Brown bears can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour, and the distance between the bear and William Anderson disappeared with terrifying rapidity. Patty Collins' wildlife expertise told her that the situation had already moved beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. She began shouting warnings about not running, trying to share knowledge that might save lives, even as chaos erupted around her. Her scientific mind was already analyzing the bear's behavior patterns, noting the focused intensity and lack of defensive posturing that indicated a food-motivated attack rather than territorial behavior. The first contact between bear and human occurred at 12:07, when the charging animal overtook William Anderson just 30 feet from the main food preparation area. The impact was devastating, with the bear's massive paw striking William in the back and sending him tumbling to the ground with tremendous force. The sound of the impact was audible across the entire picnic area, a sickening combination of breaking bones and tearing flesh that would haunt survivors for years to come. William's screams as the bear began mauling him triggered pandemonium among the other picnickers. People ran in all directions, some toward vehicles, others toward the false safety of the nearby trees. The bear's attack on William was brief but savage, with powerful jaws and claws, inflicting massive trauma before the animal's attention was diverted by other movement around the picnic area. Tom Mitchell's attempt to distract the bear by throwing a folding chair proved partially successful, causing the animal to momentarily abandon William Anderson and turn toward this new perceived threat. The brief respite allowed William to crawl toward cover behind one of the picnic tables, though his injuries were already severe enough to require immediate medical attention. Blood poured from deep gashes on his back and arms, and his left leg was clearly broken from the initial impact. The bear's response to Tom's intervention was swift and terrifying. Rather than being intimidated by the human's aggressive actions, the animal charged directly toward Tom with the focused intensity of a predator that had identified a threat to be eliminated. Tom's fishing experience had taught him to think quickly under pressure, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of facing 600 pounds of charging brown bear. State Trooper Hayes finally opened fire when the bear closed to within 20 feet of Tom Mitchell. His service weapon, a .40 caliber pistol, was woefully inadequate for stopping a charging brown bear, but the sound of gunshots temporarily disrupted the animal's attack. The bear stumbled but did not fall, the small caliber rounds insufficient to penetrate the massive shoulder muscles and thick hide that protected his vital organs. James Murphy's .44 Magnum proved more effective when he fired from a position near the parked vehicles. His first shot struck the bear in the shoulder, spinning the animal partially around and causing him to roar with pain and rage. The wound was serious, but not immediately incapacitating, and the bear's response was to redirect his attack toward this new source of injury and threat. The sound of large-caliber gunfire mixed with human screams and the bear's roars created a cacophony of violence that shattered the peaceful wilderness setting. Dr. Westbrook and Jessica Parker worked frantically to reach William Anderson, who was bleeding profusely from his initial mauling. The distance between their position and the injured man seemed like miles as the bear continued to rampage through the picnic area. Margaret Thornton's attempt to reach her pickup truck was cut short when the wounded bear intercepted her path, apparently attracted by her movement and panicked screaming. The animal's behavior had become increasingly erratic as pain and adrenaline combined to override normal behavioral patterns. His attacks were becoming less focused on food acquisition and more directed toward eliminating perceived threats. The mauling of Margaret Thornton began at 12:09 and lasted for nearly 3 minutes, an eternity of violence that would leave her with life-threatening injuries and permanent disabilities. The bear's massive jaws closed around her right arm, breaking bones with the sound of snapping branches, while his claws raked across her back and chest. Her screams echoed across the forest as other picnickers watched in helpless horror. Murphy's second shot with the .44 Magnum struck the bear in the hindquarters, causing the animal to release Margaret and spin toward this persistent source of pain. The bear's roar of rage was audible for miles through the forest as he charged toward Murphy with the single-minded fury of a wounded predator. Murphy's bush pilot experience had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but the sight of 600 pounds of enraged brown bear charging directly at him tested every limit of human courage. Tom Mitchell's intervention at this critical moment likely saved Murphy's life. Using a propane tank as a weapon, Tom struck the bear across the head just as the animal was about to reach the pilot. The impact was sufficient to stagger the bear momentarily, though it also redirected the animal's fury toward Tom. The bear's massive paw caught Tom across the chest, sending him flying backward to land hard against one of the parked vehicles. The chaos at the picnic site had now lasted over 5 minutes, with multiple people injured and the bear still actively aggressive, despite being wounded by gunfire. Dr. Westbrook and Jessica Parker found themselves in an impossible situation, with injured people scattered across the area and no safe way to provide medical assistance while the bear remained active. William Anderson was losing blood rapidly from his mauling wounds, while Margaret Thornton's injuries appeared even more severe. State Trooper Hayes had reloaded his service weapon and continued firing at the bear, though his training had not prepared him for the reality that even multiple pistol rounds might not immediately stop a large brown bear. His radio calls for emergency assistance had finally gotten through to dispatch, but help was still at least 30 minutes away, given the remote location of the recreation area. The bear's behavior began to show signs of the cumulative effects of his wounds around 12:14. His movements became somewhat less coordinated, and his charges less sustained as blood loss and shock began to take their toll. However, he remained extremely dangerous, and his unpredictable movements made it impossible for the survivors to mount any organized response or provide aid to the injured. Arthur Davidson, the retired logger whose decades of wilderness experience had taught him to read animal behavior, made the critical observation that the bear was beginning to weaken. He began shouting instructions to the other survivors, directing them to maintain distance while slowly moving toward defensive positions near the vehicles. His calm voice, in the midst of chaos, provided desperately needed leadership as people struggled to think clearly under extreme stress. The turning point in the attack came when James Murphy, despite his own injuries from being knocked around during the melee, managed to fire his remaining rounds into the bear's chest cavity. The 44 Magnum rounds, fired at close range, finally inflicted the kind of damage necessary to begin incapacitating the massive animal. The bear staggered, coughed up blood, and began showing signs of serious internal injuries. Dr. Westbrook seized the opportunity to reach William Anderson, whose condition had deteriorated significantly during the prolonged attack. The heavy equipment operator was conscious but in severe shock, with multiple deep lacerations and what appeared to be internal injuries from the bear's initial charge. Jessica Parker joined the doctor in providing emergency medical care, though their supplies were limited and the severity of the injuries exceeded their immediate capabilities. Margaret Thornton's condition was even more critical. The bear's attack had resulted in a compound fracture of her right arm, severe lacerations across her back and chest, and possible spinal injuries from being thrown around by the massive animal. She was conscious but barely responsive, showing signs of severe blood loss and potential organ damage. Dr. Westbrook made the difficult decision to focus initial efforts on stopping her bleeding, while Jessica worked to stabilize William Anderson. The bear's final moments were both relief and tragedy for the survivors. The wounded animal stumbled toward the forest edge, his movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated as internal bleeding and organ damage took their toll. He collapsed approximately 75 yards from the main picnic area, still breathing but no longer able to maintain the aggressive behavior that had terrorized the gathering for nearly 10 minutes. Tom Mitchell's injuries included multiple broken ribs and a punctured lung from his collision with the vehicle, though his wounds were less immediately life-threatening than those of the primary mauling victims. He remained conscious and was able to assist with basic first aid, while Dr. Westbrook and Jessica Parker worked to save the most critically injured. The immediate aftermath of the attack revealed the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen the peaceful church gathering. In addition to the 3 most seriously injured victims, nearly a dozen other people had sustained various injuries during the panic and chaos. These ranged from cuts and bruises from falls during the evacuation to more serious injuries, like Frank Kozlowski's broken ankle, sustained when he fell while running toward his vehicle. State Trooper Hayes maintained radio contact with emergency services throughout the crisis, providing detailed updates on casualties and the need for multiple ambulances and helicopter evacuation. The remote location of Bear Creek Recreation Area meant that even emergency response would be challenging, with the nearest hospital over an hour away by ground ambulance under ideal conditions. The psychological trauma of witnessing and surviving the attack was immediately apparent among the survivors. Several people sat in shocked silence, staring at the blood-soaked picnic area where their peaceful gathering had been transformed into a scene of violence and terror. Others compulsively retold their experiences, their voices shaking with adrenaline and disbelief as they struggled to process what had just occurred. Pastor David Smith, who had been knocked unconscious early in the attack when he fell while trying to reach the injured, regained consciousness to find his congregation scattered and traumatized. Despite his own injuries and disorientation, he immediately began moving among his people, offering comfort and prayer while assisting with the wounded. His leadership during the immediate aftermath would later be credited with helping hold the community together during their darkest hour. The first emergency responders began arriving at 12:43 when a team of paramedics from Central Peninsula Hospital reached the scene after receiving Hayes's radio calls. Their initial assessment confirmed the worst fears about the severity of the injuries, and they immediately called for helicopter evacuation of the most critical patients. The sight of the blood-soaked picnic area and wounded bear shocked even these experienced emergency workers. The helicopter evacuation of Margaret Thornton and William Anderson began at 1:15, with the aircraft landing in the highway clearing adjacent to the recreation area. Both patients were unconscious by this point, their conditions having deteriorated during the 30-minute wait for advanced medical care. Dr. Westbrook and Jessica Parker had done everything possible with limited resources, but the severity of the mauling injuries required the kind of surgical intervention that was only available at a major trauma center. Tom Mitchell was transported by ground ambulance to Central Peninsula Hospital, where his punctured lung and broken ribs could be treated without the need for helicopter evacuation. His condition was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, and his conscious state allowed him to provide valuable information to investigators about the sequence of events during the attack. The investigation of the attack scene began even while emergency medical care was still being provided. Alaska State Troopers and Fish and Game officials documented the location of the bear, the positions where the attacks occurred, and the physical evidence that would be crucial for understanding how the incident unfolded. The bear's body was photographed extensively before being transported for necropsy examination. Wildlife biologist Patty Collins found herself in the unique position of being both a survivor and an expert witness to the attack. Her professional knowledge of bear behavior allowed her to provide crucial insights to investigators about the animal's actions and motivations. Her preliminary assessment was that the bear had been food conditioned through previous positive experiences with human food sources, making it both unafraid of humans and motivated to approach the picnic area. The necropsy examination of the bear would later reveal important information about the factors that contributed to the attack. The animal was found to be undernourished compared to normal seasonal patterns, with body fat reserves indicating that he had not been successfully feeding on salmon during the critical summer months. His stomach contents included plastic bags and food wrappers, evidence of previous raids on human food sources that had conditioned his behavior. More significantly, the bear showed signs of having been in multiple previous conflicts with humans. Old scars and healed wounds indicated that he had survived encounters with other people, possibly including non-fatal gunshot wounds that had failed to deter his increasingly aggressive behavior toward human food sources. Each successful raid had reinforced his learned behavior that humans represented feeding opportunities rather than threats to be avoided. The emergency room at Central Peninsula Hospital became a scene of controlled chaos as the most seriously injured victims arrived for treatment. Margaret Thornton's condition required immediate surgery to repair internal injuries and address her massive blood loss. The surgical team worked for over 6 hours to stabilize her condition, though her long-term prognosis remained uncertain due to the severity of her injuries. William Anderson's treatment focused on addressing his internal injuries and repairing the extensive soft tissue damage from the bear's claws and teeth. His broken leg required orthopedic surgery, while plastic surgeons worked to close the deep lacerations that covered his back and arms. The psychological trauma team was called in early to help him process the experience while he was still in critical condition. Tom Mitchell's recovery was more straightforward, though still serious. Surgery to repair his punctured lung was successful, and his broken ribs were treated conservatively with pain management and careful monitoring for complications. His status as a conscious witness made him valuable to investigators, though hospital staff were careful to limit interviews until his condition stabilized. The response of the broader community to news of the bear attack was immediate and overwhelming. Local radio stations interrupted regular programming to report the incident, and by evening, news crews from Anchorage and even the lower 48 were making plans to travel to the Kenai Peninsula to cover the story. The attack quickly became national news due to its severity and the number of people involved. Pastor Smith found himself thrust into the role of community spokesman and grief counselor, as he dealt with both his own trauma and the needs of his traumatized congregation. The small chapel in Cooper Landing became a gathering point for families and friends seeking information about their loved ones and trying to make sense of the tragedy that had befallen their peaceful community. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding the attack revealed troubling information about missed opportunities for prevention. Fish and game records showed that the bear had been involved in at least 2 previous incidents at campgrounds along the Sterling Highway, but budget constraints had prevented relocation efforts. The decision to delay action would become a source of controversy as families of the victims demanded accountability for the tragedy. Environmental factors also contributed to the perfect storm of circumstances that led to the attack. The poor salmon run that summer had forced bears throughout the peninsula to seek alternative food sources, bringing them into increased contact with human populations. Climate change effects on traditional food cycles were creating unpredictable situations where bears were more desperate and therefore more dangerous than usual. The legal ramifications of the attack began almost immediately, with families of the most seriously injured victims consulting attorneys about potential liability. Questions were raised about whether adequate warnings had been posted about bear activity in the area, whether emergency response procedures were sufficient for such remote locations, and whether wildlife management agencies had fulfilled their responsibilities to protect public safety. Media coverage of the attack focused heavily on the heroic actions of individuals like James Murphy and Tom Mitchell, whose quick thinking and courage had likely prevented even greater tragedy. State Trooper Hayes was also praised for his professional response under extreme circumstances, though questions were raised about whether law enforcement officers in bear country should be equipped with more effective weapons for such situations. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass the entire community of survivors. Many people who had witnessed the mauling suffered from post-traumatic stress symptoms that would require months or years of treatment. The peaceful nature of the church gathering made the sudden violence even more psychologically devastating for those who experienced it. Dr. Richard Westbrook struggled with feelings of helplessness despite his medical training and decades of emergency experience. The severity of the injuries and the limited resources available at the remote location had tested his professional capabilities in ways he had never experienced. His decision to continue practicing emergency medicine was questioned by family members who worried about the psychological toll of the incident. Jessica Parker's emergency room experience proved invaluable during the crisis, but she too struggled with the aftermath of treating such severe trauma under primitive conditions. Her professional competence during the attack was widely praised, though she privately questioned whether different decisions might have saved more lives or prevented more serious injuries. The recovery process for the most seriously injured victims would prove to be measured in months and years rather than days and weeks. Margaret Thornton's injuries required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation, with permanent disabilities that would affect her independence and quality of life for the remainder of her years. Her arm would never regain full function, and chronic pain became a constant companion. William Anderson's recovery involved not only physical healing, but also psychological counseling to address the trauma of being the bear's first victim. His memory of the attack was fragmentary due to shock and head injuries, but the psychological scars were deep and lasting. His return to heavy equipment operation was uncertain due to both physical limitations and anxiety about working in remote areas. Tom Mitchell's injuries healed relatively well, though he struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance that made his commercial fishing career more challenging. The close-knit nature of Alaska's fishing community provided support, but the psychological effects of the attack created lasting changes in his personality and approach to risk management. The investigation's final report, released 6 months after the attack, concluded that the incident was the result of multiple systemic failures rather than any single cause. Inadequate funding for wildlife management programs, insufficient warning systems for recreational areas, and the lack of standardized emergency response procedures for remote locations all contributed to the tragedy. Recommendations from the investigation included increased funding for bear relocation programs, improved communication systems for remote recreational areas, better training for law enforcement officers in wildlife conflict situations, and enhanced public education about bear safety. Implementation of these recommendations became a political issue as state budget constraints limited the resources available for wildlife management programs. The bear attack at Bear Creek Recreation Area would be remembered as one of the most serious wildlife attacks in Alaska's recent history, not only because of the number of people injured, but also because of the systemic issues it revealed about human-wildlife conflict management. The peaceful church picnic that was meant to celebrate community fellowship instead became a tragic reminder of the risks inherent in sharing Alaska's wilderness with its apex predators. 1 year after the attack, Pastor Smith organized a memorial service at the same location where the tragedy had occurred. The gathering was smaller and more subdued than the original picnic, with enhanced safety measures, including armed guards and emergency medical personnel standing by. The service focused on healing and remembrance, honoring both the survivors and the lessons learned from their traumatic experience. Margaret Thornton, still recovering from her injuries but determined to face her fears, attended the memorial service despite her family's concerns. Her presence served as inspiration for other survivors who were still struggling with anxiety about returning to wilderness areas. Her courage in facing the location of her trauma became a symbol of resilience for the entire community. The economic impact of the attack extended beyond the immediate medical costs to affect tourism and recreation throughout the peninsula. Campground reservations declined significantly in the months following the incident, as families reconsidered the wisdom of camping in areas known for bear activity. Local businesses that depended on summer tourism felt the effects of reduced visitor numbers. Educational programs about bear safety became mandatory for all recreational permit holders in the area, with special emphasis on food storage, waste management, and emergency response procedures. The curriculum was developed using lessons learned from the attack, with input from survivors about the realities of human-bear encounters. The incident also sparked broader discussions about wildlife management philosophy in Alaska. Some advocates argued for more aggressive relocation or elimination of problem bears, while others emphasized the need for better human behavior modification to reduce conflicts. The debate reflected larger tensions between conservation values and public safety concerns. Dr. Westbrook eventually returned to limited medical practice, though he never fully recovered from the psychological impact of treating such severe trauma under emergency conditions. His experience became part of medical training programs that emphasized the challenges of providing care in remote wilderness settings. Jessica Parker used her experience from the attack to develop training programs for emergency medical personnel working in Alaska's remote areas. Her protocols for mass casualty events in wilderness settings became standard training for paramedics and flight nurses throughout the state. State Trooper Hayes was promoted to a supervisory position, partly based on his professional performance during the bear attack crisis. He used his new role to advocate for better equipment and training for officers working in areas where wildlife encounters were common. James Murphy continued his bush pilot career, but became an advocate for improved emergency response capabilities in remote areas. His experience during the attack led to the development of better communication systems and emergency supply caches in popular recreation areas. The families of the victims formed a support group that continued to meet regularly years after the attack. Their shared experience of trauma and recovery created bonds that extended beyond their original church community to encompass anyone affected by wildlife attacks in Alaska. Wildlife biologist Patty Collins used her professional expertise and personal experience as a survivor to develop improved protocols for assessing and managing food-conditioned bears. Her research on the behavioral patterns that led to the attack became influential in wildlife management programs throughout North America. The bear attack at Bear Creek Recreation Area ultimately served as a tragic but valuable learning experience for wildlife managers, emergency responders, and outdoor enthusiasts throughout Alaska and beyond. The courage and resilience demonstrated by the survivors became an inspiration for others facing their own wilderness challenges, while the lessons learned from the incident helped prevent similar tragedies in other locations. The annual memorial service became a tradition that honored not only the victims and survivors of the attack, but also the broader community of people who shared Alaska's wilderness with its magnificent and dangerous wildlife. Each year brought new understanding of the complex relationships between humans and bears, and new commitments to finding ways to coexist safely in one of Earth's last great wilderness areas. As the years passed, the site of the attack was slowly reclaimed by the forest, though markers remained to commemorate the events that had unfolded there. Bear Creek continued to flow past the recreation area, carrying with it the memories of that terrible August day when nature's power was displayed in its most raw and unforgiving form. The survivors carried their own memories forward, forever changed by their encounter with one of Alaska's apex predators, but determined to honor their experience by helping others understand and respect the wilderness they had learned to fear and love in equal measure. The next stories. Number sign, The Last Hunt. The October wind carried the scent of snow down from the Cabinet Mountains as Sarah Chen adjusted her backpack straps for the third time in 10 minutes. At 28, she had spent enough years guiding hunters through Montana's wilderness to recognize when nature was preparing for an early winter. But this morning felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on her arms stand despite her thick fleece jacket. The parking area at Koocanusa Lake's northern access point held only 4 vehicles: her dented Subaru Outback, the massive Ford F-350 belonging to her clients, a Forest Service pickup, and a lone motorcycle that seemed oddly out of place given the dropping temperatures. Marcus Holloway emerged from the passenger side of the Ford, his expensive hunting gear still bearing creases from the package. Everything about the 45-year-old investment banker screamed money, from his custom Weatherby rifle to his boots that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. His younger brother David followed, looking far more comfortable in worn canvas pants and a faded jacket that had seen actual use. The contrast between the brothers had been apparent from their first phone call 3 weeks ago, when Marcus insisted on booking the most expensive package while David quietly asked about trail conditions and wildlife patterns. "Weather's looking questionable," Sarah said, checking her GPS unit one final time. "We've got maybe 6 hours before this front moves in properly. If we're doing this, we need to move fast and smart." Marcus waved dismissively, shouldering his pack with practiced efficiency despite its obvious weight. "We didn't fly out here from Chicago to turn around because of a little wind. David's been planning this trip for 2 years. David shot his brother a look that carried decades of sibling tension. "Actually, Marcus, you planned this trip. I just wanted to spend some time outdoors." He turned to Sarah with an apologetic smile. "Don't mind him. He thinks money can control weather patterns." The 4th member of their party approached from the Forest Service vehicle, her ranger uniform crisp despite the early hour. Jennifer Martinez had been patrolling this section of the Kootenai National Forest for 8 years, and Sarah had worked with her enough to recognize the subtle tension in the ranger's shoulders. At 34, Martinez had the kind of situational awareness that came from years of dealing with both human and animal unpredictability in wilderness settings. "Grizzly activity's been unusual this week," Martinez said without preamble. "We've had 3 separate encounters in the last 5 days, all within a 10-mile radius of where you're headed. Fish and Wildlife thinks it might be a dispersed male looking for winter denning sites." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Dispersed grizzlies were dangerous precisely because they were unpredictable, often young males kicked out of established territories or older bears whose normal patterns had been disrupted. "How big are we talking?" "Trail cameras caught one that Wildlife estimates around 600 pounds. Could be bigger." Martinez pulled out a tablet, swiping to a series of grainy images. "Look at the paw prints for scale." The photos showed tracks pressed deep into muddy ground next to a standard hiking boot for comparison. Even accounting for the soft earth, the bear's front paw was nearly twice the length of the boot, with claw marks extending another 4 inches beyond the pad. Marcus leaned over Sarah's shoulder to study the images, his expensive cologne mingling oddly with the pine-scented air. "Big bear," David said quietly. "Maybe we should consider a different area." "Absolutely not," Marcus replied before Sarah could respond. "I've got meetings starting Wednesday. This is our window." Sarah caught Martinez's eye and saw her own concern reflected there. She'd guided enough hunters to recognize the type Marcus represented: successful men, accustomed to controlling their environment, who struggled to accept that wilderness operated by different rules. It wasn't necessarily malicious, but it could be dangerous when combined with the kind of expensive equipment that provided confidence without experience. "The bear's probably just passing through," Sarah said, though she didn't entirely believe it herself. "We'll make noise, stay alert, and stick to the main trails for the first day. If we see any fresh sign, we turn around immediately." "What kind of fresh sign?" David asked, genuinely interested. "Scat. Tracks less than 24 hours old, claw marks on trees, disturbed ground around water sources." Sarah shouldered her pack, feeling the familiar weight of her bear spray, flare gun, and the 45-70 rifle she carried for emergencies. Bears have distinct signatures when they're in an area. The key is reading them correctly. Martinez walked them through the standard safety briefing, covering everything from proper food storage to emergency communication protocols. The satellite communicator clipped to Sarah's belt could reach emergency services anywhere in the continental United States, but response times in this terrain ranged from 45 minutes by helicopter to several hours on foot, depending on weather conditions. "Cell coverage is non-existent past mile marker 3, Martinez continued. "If something happens, you're looking at minimum 30 minutes before help can even start moving your direction, assuming they can get aircraft up in this weather." The wind gusted stronger as they finished their preparations, sending dried leaves swirling around the parking area in small tornadoes. Sarah checked her watch. 7:15 a.m., exactly on schedule. Their planned route would take them 8 miles northwest along Pipe Creek Trail to a hunting area that had produced several trophy elk in recent years. The trail itself was well maintained for the first 5 miles before branching into a network of game paths that required careful navigation. "One more thing," Martinez said as they prepared to leave. "The motorcycle belongs to a photographer who's been documenting wildlife behavior up here for the past month. Alex Petrov works for National Geographic. If you run into him, he might have current information about animal movement patterns." "Solo photographer in grizzly country?" Sarah frowned. "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Little of both, probably. He's got 15 years' experience in Alaska, so he's not completely green. Just keep an eye out." They set off single file with Sarah leading, followed by David, then Marcus, with Jennifer Martinez walking alongside them for the first mile before turning back to her patrol duties. The trail began as a wide, clearly marked path through mixed forest of Douglas fir, western larch, and lodgepole pine. Morning light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating small clearings where deer had bedded down overnight. Sarah maintained a steady pace while keeping up a running commentary about the terrain and wildlife signs they encountered. This was partly educational, partly practical, and partly a way to make enough noise to avoid surprising any animals. The brothers responded differently to her guidance. David asked thoughtful questions about animal behavior and tracking techniques, while Marcus seemed more interested in the mechanical aspects of hunting, discussing optimal shooting distances and ammunition performance. Elk tend to move through this area during early morning and late evening, Sarah explained as they paused at an overlook approximately 2 miles from the trailhead. The thermals carry scent up the valley during the day, so they'll bed down in the timber until afternoon. Below them, Pipe Creek wound through a series of meadows connected by narrow corridors of forest. The water ran clear and fast, fed by snowmelt from peaks that were already showing white above the tree line. It was exactly the kind of terrain that attracted both elk and the predators that hunted them. David knelt beside a large pine tree, studying something near its base. "Sarah, what made these marks?" The scratches on the bark started about 4 feet from the ground and extended up another 3 feet, too high and too wide to be made by a black bear. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she examined the claw marks more closely. They were recent, probably within the last few days, and the tree showed additional signs of disturbance, including broken branches and scattered bark at its base. "Grizzly marking tree," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Males will do this to establish territory or communicate with other bears." Marcus joined them, running his fingers along the deepest gouges. How big would a bear have to be to reach this high? Standing on hind legs? 7 feet minimum. Maybe 8. Sarah pulled out her camera to document the marks, partly for Martinez and partly because detailed photos might be important later. "This is exactly the kind of fresh sign we talked about." "But it's not on our route," Marcus pointed out. "We're just passing through this area." "Bear territory doesn't follow human trail maps," David said, earning an annoyed look from his brother. "If he's marking trees here, he considers this whole area his space." Sarah studied the GPS coordinates and compared them to their planned route. The marking tree stood roughly half a mile from their intended camping spot, close enough to suggest the bear was actively using the entire drainage. Protocol suggested turning back, but Marcus had made his position clear, and Sarah found herself weighing competing risks, disappointing a client against potentially dangerous wildlife encounter. "We continue, but we modify the plan," she decided. "We'll scout the area thoroughly before committing to an overnight stay. Any additional fresh sign, and we head back immediately." They resumed hiking with increased vigilance, Sarah pausing frequently to scan the forest and check for additional bear sign. The wind had picked up significantly, making it difficult to hear approaching animals and causing the forest to creak and sway in ways that masked natural sounds. These were exactly the conditions that led to dangerous encounters: limited visibility, environmental noise, and wildlife potentially seeking shelter from incoming weather. At mile marker 4, they encountered their first significant piece of fresh bear sign. David spotted it first, a large pile of scat directly in the center of the trail, steaming slightly in the cool air. Sarah approached cautiously, noting the size, consistency, and contents while maintaining safe distance. "Less than 2 hours old," she announced. "Probably the same bear from the marking tree, based on size. He's definitely active in this immediate area. The scat contained partially digested berries, some fur that looked like deer, and what appeared to be fish bones. It was the diet of a large, healthy omnivore preparing for winter hibernation. Sarah photographed the sign from multiple angles, while Marcus and David waited 20 feet back. "So what's the protocol here?" David asked. "This seems like pretty clear evidence we're in his territory." "Bears use trails just like we do," Sarah explained. "The fact that he left scat here could mean he's claiming the trail, or it could just be convenient timing. The concerning part is how fresh it is." Marcus checked his expensive watch. "We've invested 4 hours of hiking to reach this point. I'm not turning around because of some bear droppings." "Marcus, don't be an idiot," David snapped. "This isn't about your schedule." The tension between the brothers had been building throughout the morning, and Sarah recognized the dynamic that made some guiding situations dangerous. Family hunting trips often carried emotional baggage that had nothing to do with wildlife, and stress could lead to poor decision-making in critical moments. "Here's what we're going to do," Sarah said firmly. "We'll continue to our planned lunch spot another mile ahead. That'll give us a good vantage point to glass the area and look for additional sign. If everything looks clear, we'll make camp. If not, we turn around." The next mile passed without incident, though Sarah noticed several additional trees showing bark disturbance and what looked like daybeds in thick cover where large animals had recently rested. The trail climbed steadily through dense forest before opening into a natural meadow that provided excellent visibility in multiple directions. Their lunch spot offered commanding views of the drainage system they'd been following, with clear lines of sight up 3 separate valleys where elk might appear. Sarah set up her spotting scope while the brothers unpacked sandwiches and thermoses of coffee. The normalcy of the meal contrasted sharply with her growing unease about the amount of bear sign they'd encountered. "There," David said suddenly, pointing toward a distant ridgeline. "Movement in the trees." Sarah swung the scope toward his indicated direction and immediately picked up a large, dark shape moving through timber roughly 800 yards away. Even at that distance, the animal's size and gait were unmistakable. "Grizzly," she confirmed. "Big male moving parallel to our position." Marcus grabbed his binoculars, scanning frantically until he located the bear. "Jesus, look at the size of that thing." The bear appeared completely unaware of their presence as it moved through the forest with surprising grace for such a large animal. Sarah estimated its weight at 550 to 600 pounds, matching Martinez's description of the dispersed male. Its behavior seemed normal, purposeful movement through known territory rather than agitated searching or aggressive posturing. "He's heading away from our planned camp area," Sarah observed. "Could be good news for us." "Or he could circle back," David pointed out. "How far is our camp from here?" "About 2 miles northeast. Different drainage, but bears don't respect watershed boundaries." Sarah continued tracking the grizzly until it disappeared into heavy timber. "The question is whether he's just passing through or actively hunting this area." They finished lunch while maintaining visual surveillance of the surrounding terrain. Sarah used the time to study topographic maps and plan alternative routes in case they needed to leave quickly. The incoming weather front was clearly visible now as a wall of dark clouds approaching from the west, with the first wisps of high cirrus indicating they had perhaps 3 hours before conditions deteriorated significantly. "Decision time," Sarah announced as they packed up lunch gear. "We can continue to the planned camp and hope our friend keeps moving, or we can set up here in the open meadow where we'll have good visibility but limited shelter." "What's your professional recommendation?" David asked. Sarah considered the options while watching the distant storm clouds. Camping in the open would provide security from bears but leave them exposed to weather. The planned campsite offered shelter and water access, but sat in dense forest where bear encounters became exponentially more dangerous. Professionally, I'd recommend we head back to the vehicle and try again when bear activity decreases. She held up a hand as Marcus started to object. But if we're continuing, I want us in the meadow where we can see what's coming. That's not why we came here, Marcus said. We're not going to bag anything from an open meadow. We're not going to bag anything if we're dead either, David replied. Sarah knows this country better than we do. The argument might have continued, but Sarah's satellite communicator chirped with an incoming message. She checked the display and felt her stomach drop. Martinez, she announced. Emergency bulletin. Second bear reported in area, approximately 4 miles northwest of our position. Trail closure recommended for all non-essential personnel. How can there be 2 bears? Marcus demanded. I thought you said it was just one dispersed male. I said that's what we thought, Sarah corrected. Bears don't check in with rangers about their travel plans. If there are multiple animals in the area, the danger level just increased exponentially. She typed a quick response to Martinez. Currently, 2 miles north of Pipe Creek Junction with 2 clients. Plan to camp meadow location unless advised otherwise. The response came back within minutes. Negative on camping. Weather deteriorating faster than predicted. Snow possible by 1800 hours. Recommend immediate return to Trailhead. Sarah showed the message to both brothers. David nodded immediately, while Marcus looked frustrated but resigned. The decision had been made for them by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Pack everything, Sarah ordered. We're moving out now. Different route back to avoid our morning trail in case our bear friend is still in that area. The return hike began with good visibility and moderate wind, but conditions deteriorated rapidly as they descended through increasingly dense forest. Sarah chose a route that paralleled Pipe Creek but stayed on higher ground, avoiding the thick riparian vegetation where bears often traveled. The alternative path was more difficult but provided better sightlines and multiple escape routes. Approximately 1 mile from the meadow, David stopped abruptly and grabbed Sarah's arm. Do you hear that? Sarah paused to listen, filtering out wind noise and forest sounds. Beneath the natural ambience, she detected something that made her blood run cold. The rhythmic breathing and movement sounds of a large animal paralleling their route through dense cover. Everyone stop, she whispered. Don't move. The sounds continued for several seconds before stopping completely. Sarah slowly turned her head, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, while her hand moved instinctively toward her bear spray. Marcus and David stood frozen behind her, smart enough to recognize the seriousness of their situation. What do we do? David breathed, barely audible. We back away, slowly, Sarah replied, her voice equally quiet. No sudden movements. If it's a bear, it knows we're here, but hasn't decided what to do about it. They began a careful retreat, moving 1 step at a time while maintaining visual contact with the forest around them. Sarah kept her bear spray ready, while also preparing to access her flare gun if the situation escalated. Behind her, she could hear Marcus's expensive gear rattling softly, despite his efforts to move quietly. The parallel movement resumed, keeping pace with their retreat but maintaining distance. Sarah estimated the unseen animal was roughly 50 yards away, moving through terrain that provided perfect concealment while offering multiple approach routes. It was textbook stalking behavior, though whether the animal was curious, territorial, or predatory remained unclear. There, Marcus whispered. 2 o'clock, heavy timber. Sarah followed his gaze and caught a glimpse of brown fur moving between trees. The animal was massive, easily the size of the bear they'd observed earlier, but this one's behavior was markedly different. Instead of purposeful travel, it was actively shadowing their movement while using available cover. Keep moving, Sarah ordered. Don't run, but don't stop either. They covered another 100 yards before the stalking behavior ceased. Sarah waited several minutes, listening carefully before allowing herself to relax slightly. Whatever had been following them had either lost interest or decided they weren't worth the effort. "Was that normal bear behavior?" David asked once they'd put significant distance between themselves and the encounter. "No," Sarah admitted. "Curious bears will investigate briefly and then leave. Defensive bears will make their presence known to warn you off. That was predatory behavior." Marcus looked pale despite his earlier bravado. "Predatory toward humans? Bears don't typically hunt humans, but large males have been known to investigate people as potential prey, especially if they're stressed or hungry." Sarah checked her GPS to confirm their position. "The good news is we're only about 40 minutes from the trailhead at our current pace." The forest around them had grown noticeably darker as storm clouds blocked increasing amounts of sunlight. Temperature was dropping rapidly, and Sarah could smell snow in the air despite the early date. These were conditions that would drive wildlife to seek shelter and make them less predictable in their behavior. They made good time for the next 20 minutes, covering familiar ground with increased confidence. Sarah began to believe they might complete the hike without further incident when David spotted something that stopped them cold. "Those are our tracks from this morning," he said, pointing to clear boot prints in a muddy section of trail. "But look at what's on top of them." The massive paw prints were clearly visible in the soft earth, pressed directly over their morning footprints. The bear had not only found their trail, but had been following their exact route, probably within the last hour based on the sharp edges of the tracks. "He's behind us," Sarah said, feeling her heart rate spike, "and he's tracking us." Marcus fumbled for his rifle, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "No, if we're being hunted, running or showing aggression will trigger an attack. We need to make ourselves appear larger and less like prey." She pulled out her bear spray and flare gun while instructing both brothers to raise their arms and make noise. They began moving again, but faster now, calling out loudly and banging gear together. The goal was to convince any following bear that they were too much trouble to be worth attacking. "How far behind us do you think he is?" David asked, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Based on track freshness, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Sarah scanned the forest continuously while maintaining their pace. "The good news is we're close to the trailhead. Bears are less likely to approach areas with vehicle noise and human scent." They crested a small ridge and suddenly had visual contact with the parking area roughly half a mile below. Sarah's Subaru sat exactly where she'd left it, along with Martinez's Forest Service vehicle. The sight of civilization provided psychological relief, even though they weren't safe yet. "That's Martinez's truck," Sarah observed. "She must be waiting for us." The final descent took them through the most dangerous terrain of the entire day, a narrow section of trail bordered by thick brush that provided perfect ambush cover. Sarah moved slowly, checking every shadow while the brothers followed close behind. Her finger rested on the bear spray trigger as they navigated the exposed approach. They were within 200 yards of the parking area when the attack happened. The grizzly came from their left flank, exploding out of heavy cover with shocking speed for such a massive animal. Sarah had perhaps 2 seconds to register its presence before 600 pounds of muscle and fury covered the distance between them. Her bear spray deployment was instinctive, but poorly aimed due to the surprise and speed of the attack. "Run!" she screamed, though she knew running was often the worst response to a bear attack. Marcus tried to unsling his rifle, but stumbled over his own pack, going down hard on the rocky trail. David grabbed his brother's arm and hauled him upright as the bear closed the final gap. Sarah got off a second burst of bear spray that caught the grizzly's face, causing it to pause and shake its head violently. The momentary distraction allowed all 3 humans to scramble toward the parking area, but the bear's pause lasted only seconds. It resumed pursuit with renewed aggression, its powerful legs covering ground faster than any human could run. Sarah could hear its breathing and the sound of claws on stone as it gained on them. Martinez appeared at the edge of the parking area with her service weapon drawn, but the angle prevented any safe shot with humans in the line of fire. She began yelling and firing shots into the air, trying to distract the attacking bear without hitting the fleeing people. David reached the parking area first and dove behind Sarah's Subaru. Marcus was slower, his expensive gear and soft conditioning making the sprint nearly impossible. The bear was within 10 feet when Marcus stumbled again, this time going down hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Sarah made a split-second decision that probably saved Marcus's life. Instead of continuing to safety, she turned back toward the attacking bear, deploying her flare gun directly into its face from a distance of less than 6 feet. The red phosphorus burst, caught the grizzly in the eyes and nose, causing it to rear back on its hind legs with a roar that echoed off the surrounding mountains. The distraction allowed Marcus to scramble the final distance to safety, but it also focused the bear's attention entirely on Sarah. The massive animal dropped back to all fours and charged directly at her, its small eyes filled with pain and rage from the flare strike. Martinez finally had a clear shot and took it, her .40 caliber service pistol bucking in her hands as she put 3 rounds center mass into the charging grizzly. The bear stumbled but didn't go down, its momentum carrying it forward even as blood began to appear on its brown fur. Sarah dove sideways, trying to get behind her vehicle, but the bear's massive paw caught her left shoulder and spun her around. The claws raked through her jacket and into flesh, though the thick material absorbed much of the impact. She hit the ground hard but immediately rolled away from the bear's position. Martinez continued firing, putting 2 more rounds into the grizzly before it finally collapsed 20 feet from Sarah's position. The massive animal thrashed briefly before becoming still, its sides no longer rising and falling with breath. "Sarah," David called out, "are you hurt?" She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain shot through her shoulder and ribs. Her jacket was torn and bloody, but the wounds appeared to be lacerations rather than deep punctures. Marcus emerged from behind the vehicle, his face pale but otherwise uninjured. "Is everyone else okay?" Martinez called out, approaching the dead bear with her weapon still drawn. "David's fine. Marcus is shaken up but not hurt," Sarah reported. "I've got claw marks on my shoulder but nothing life-threatening." Martinez confirmed the bear was dead before holstering her weapon and approaching to examine Sarah's injuries. The claw marks were ugly, but relatively shallow, more like deep scratches than the devastating wounds a grizzly was capable of inflicting. The bear's strike had been hurried and off balance due to the flare distraction. "You need medical attention," Martinez decided. "Those wounds need cleaning and probably stitches." "What about the bear?" David asked, staring at the massive carcass. "Was this the one we saw earlier?" Martinez examined the animal while Sarah sat against her vehicle and tried to process what had just happened. The bear was indeed a large male, probably the same one they'd observed during lunch, though determining its exact identity would require more detailed investigation. "Definitely a mature male, probably 8 or 9 years old based on tooth wear," Martinez reported. "He's in good condition, well-fed, no obvious signs of disease or injury that would explain aggressive behavior." "So why did he attack?" Marcus asked. "Everything I've read says grizzlies avoid humans." "They do usually," Martinez replied. "But this time of year, males are preparing for hibernation and can be unpredictable. Add in the incoming storm, possible territorial disputes with other bears, and the fact that you were in his area for several hours, and you've got a recipe for conflict." Sarah used her satellite communicator to report the incident to emergency services, while Martinez took photographs and measurements of the bear. The carcass would need to be removed and examined by wildlife biologists to determine if there were any underlying factors that contributed to the attack. "How long before help arrives?" David asked. "Ambulance is en route, probably 20 minutes, Sarah replied. "Fish and Wildlife is sending a team to collect the bear, and there'll be paperwork to fill out for the investigation." The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving Sarah feeling shaky and exhausted. Her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and she was starting to realize how close they'd all come to serious injury or death. Marcus sat beside her, his expensive hunting gear scattered around the parking area from his frantic escape. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "You tried to warn us about the danger, and I didn't listen." "You don't owe me anything," Sarah replied. "This is part of what can happen in bear country. We all knew the risks." "But you came back for me," Marcus continued. "When the bear was chasing us, you could have kept running. Instead, you turned around and put yourself between me and 600 pounds of grizzly." Sarah didn't have a good answer for that. The decision to use her flare gun had been instinctive, the kind of split-second choice that happened too fast for conscious thought. She'd seen Marcus go down and reacted based on years of training and experience, not heroism. The ambulance arrived exactly 18 minutes later, followed closely by 2 Fish and Wildlife vehicles and a Montana Highway Patrol cruiser. Sarah submitted to medical examination while giving her statement to investigating officers. The paramedics cleaned and bandaged her wounds, determining that while painful, they weren't severe enough to require immediate hospitalization. "You're lucky," the lead paramedic explained. "Bear claws are incredibly dirty, so infection is a major concern. We'll start you on antibiotics, but you need to watch for any signs of complications." The Fish and Wildlife investigation took nearly 3 hours as biologists examined the bear carcass, documented the attack site, and interviewed all witnesses. They confirmed that the animal was the dispersed male that had been reported in the area, though they couldn't determine why it had exhibited predatory behavior toward humans. "It's possible the bear was defending a food cache we haven't found yet," the lead biologist explained. "Or it could have been territorial aggression related to the second bear reported in the area. Without more information, we can only speculate." "What happens now?" David asked. "The carcass will be taken for full necropsy to rule out disease or other factors that might explain the behavior," the biologist replied. "Your guide will need to file a report with the Outfitter Licensing Board, and there'll be a review to determine if any changes need to be made to safety protocols." By late afternoon, the investigation was complete, and Sarah was cleared to drive herself home. Marcus and David offered to stay and help with cleanup, but Martinez assured them that Fish and Wildlife would handle the remaining details. The brothers would fly back to Chicago the following morning with a story that none of their friends would quite believe. "Will you guide again?" David asked as they prepared to leave. Sarah looked at the spot where the bear had fallen, now marked only by some disturbed earth and a few drops of blood. She'd been guiding hunters and hikers for 8 years without a single serious incident, and one attack didn't negate thousands of safe miles in the wilderness. "Probably," she said, "but I'll be a lot more careful about bear sign." As the vehicles departed and quiet returned to the trailhead, Sarah sat in her Subaru and tried to process the day's events. Her shoulder throbbed, her hands were still shaking slightly, and she knew she'd be replaying those final seconds before the attack for weeks to come. But she was alive, her clients were safe, and a dangerous bear had been stopped before it could threaten other wilderness users. The forest around the parking area seemed peaceful now, with no sign of the violence that had occurred just hours earlier. Snow was beginning to fall, light flakes that would soon cover any remaining evidence of the encounter. By morning, nature would have begun to reclaim the site, and life in the Montana wilderness would continue as it had for thousands of years. Sarah started her engine and drove slowly down the access road, already planning the report she'd need to write for her insurance company and the outfitter licensing board. It would be a long night of paperwork and phone calls, but tomorrow she'd wake up alive in her own bed instead of in a hospital or morgue. In her rearview mirror, the Cabinet Mountains disappeared into low clouds and falling snow. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, another grizzly was preparing for winter hibernation, unaware that one of its kind had just reminded humans why respect for wild places remained essential for survival. The incident would make local news and prompt discussions about human-wildlife interactions in an era of increasing backcountry recreation. Wildlife biologists would study the attack report for patterns that might prevent future encounters. Outfitters would review safety protocols and emergency response procedures. But for Sarah Chen, the attack would remain a personal reminder that wilderness guiding meant accepting calculated risks in exchange for the privilege of working in some of the most beautiful and dangerous places on Earth. She would continue to guide hunters and hikers into bear country because the alternative, avoiding these places entirely, meant surrendering something essential about human connection to wild landscapes. The snow continued to fall as Sarah drove toward town, marking the end of another hunting season and the beginning of winter in Montana's grizzly country. The mountains would soon be covered in snow, the bears would enter hibernation, and the forests would grow quiet until spring brought a new cycle of life and death to the wilderness.